Good evening, and welcome. Before we begin tonight's journey into the world of the past, I would like to ask you to take a moment to like this video, to subscribe if you haven't yet, and to ring the bell so you won't miss our next stories. And please, in the comments below, tell me where you are watching from tonight. Is it somewhere warm, with the sound of crickets outside your window, or somewhere cold, where the night is still and quiet? I always enjoy knowing the places from which our listeners join these travels through time. Now, let us step softly into another era, an age where walls of paper and wood separated secrets from the rest of the world, and where a single day could feel like a lifetime. Tonight, we will follow a day in the life of a concubine in feudal Japan. Not the painted fantasies of popular culture, but the quiet, meticulous reality, steeped in ritual, discipline, and a constant awareness of one's place in a finely layered hierarchy. Our day begins before the first blush of dawn, when the palace corridors are still cloaked in the shadows of night, and the air is heavy with the mingled scents of incense and cedar wood. The concubine's chamber is small but carefully arranged. A low futon rolled neatly in the corner, lacquered boxes containing delicate robes folded with care, and a single bronze mirror polished to a soft glow. She rises in silence, for in the women's quarters sound travels easily, and discretion is as valuable as beauty. The first ritual is cleansing. A basin of cool water brought in by an attendant the night before now reflects the faint shimmer of an oil lamp. She dips her hands, then her face, letting the water wash away the last traces of sleep, and in this quiet moment, she feels the weight of her role. Every gesture, every breath, must serve the purpose of pleasing and maintaining favor. In the hierarchy of the inner palace, the concubine is not merely a woman kept for companionship. She is an instrument of alliance, a living symbol of her family's connection to power, and a potential mother to heirs. As such, her mornings are structured not for leisure, but for preparation. The first robe she wears is simple. A soft cotton underlayer dyed in pale colors, tied loosely with a sash. The more elaborate garments will come later, chosen according to the day's events and the likelihood of being summoned. Hair is an art in itself. She sits before the mirror while a maid carefully unbinds the silk cords used to keep it in shape overnight. Long, black strands are combed with slow, deliberate strokes, each movement accompanied by a whispered count to ensure symmetry. The maid applies fragrant camellia oil, smoothing it until the hair gleams like lacquer. This is not vanity, it is protocol. For in the palace, appearance is an unspoken language, and the smallest deviation from perfection could be noticed and judged. As the sun's first light filters through the shoji screens, the concubine hears the soft rustle of other women beginning their day. Some are higher in rank, wives of the Lord with the authority to command. Others are lower, attendants who carry messages, prepare baths, or fetch tea. Interactions between these women are governed by rules as strict as any written law. Greetings are offered with a bow, the depth of which reflects relative status. A concubine must bow deeper to a principal wife, but may receive such respect from attendants. She walks the corridor toward the veranda, where the morning view is part of her private ritual. Beyond the garden, the pond reflects the pale sky, and the koi move lazily beneath the surface. The scent of plum blossoms drifts in the air, faint yet distinct, reminding her of the passage of seasons. Here, in the stillness, she gathers her thoughts, aware that any moment could bring a summons. To be summoned by the Lord could mean an evening of music and poetry, a discussion of politics, or an unspoken expectation of intimacy. But until that call comes, her role is to remain ready. After this brief moment of solitude, she returns inside for breakfast. It is not the lavish meal one might expect, rather, a small tray set with rice, pickled vegetables, and a bowl of miso. The food is eaten in measured bites, for elegance in dining is as important as the garments she wears. Conversation during meals is minimal, unless initiated by someone of higher rank. The maid, kneeling nearby, waits silently for any request. Once breakfast is done, The concubine changes into her second robe of the day, a layered silk kimono, colors chosen to reflect both the season and her current standing. The combination of dyes and patterns can subtly signal favor or disfavor, alliances or rivalries within the court. Each sleeve, each fold is adjusted with precision, secured by an obi tied in a style that complements her figure without suggesting impropriety. Then comes the application of makeup. The transformation is not meant to erase the woman beneath, but to align her with the ideal of beauty revered by the court, a beauty that is both refined and controlled. By mid-morning, the palace is fully awake. The sound of sandals on wooden floors, the distant pluck of a shamisen from another chamber, the faint laughter of attendants sharing a whispered joke. Yet beneath this hum of life lies a constant tension, an awareness that every action, every word, could affect one's future. For the concubine, survival in this world is as much about observation as it is about grace. She learns to read the subtle shifts in tone, the glances exchanged in passing, the pauses in conversation. These are the signs that reveal which way the winds of favor are blowing. And so, as the first part of her day unfolds, she moves with quiet precision, carrying the weight of her position like a second skin, knowing that the path to the evening and to the Lord's attention has already begun in these small, deliberate acts. By late morning, the sun has fully risen, casting a soft golden light through the paper screens, illuminating the delicate patterns of the tatami mats beneath her feet. The concubine knows that this is the time when the palace settles into its daytime rhythm. Attendants carry messages across courtyards. The smell of tea mingles with the faint aroma of sandalwood drifting from the main hall, and the Lord's advisors begin their rounds of quiet counsel. Her own duties in these hours are both simple and intricate. She must remain poised, present, and ready for any request, yet never appear idle or restless. Today, as on most days, she is escorted by her maid to the women's practice chamber, where the arts of refinement are cultivated. Here, in a long room lined with low tables and cushions, a select group of women gathers. Some are principal wives, others concubines like herself, each absorbed in their own pursuit: calligraphy, the kodo, or the quiet game of go. She sits at her place and unfolds a sheet of fine paper, dipping a slender brush into black ink that has been ground slowly on a stone. The art of writing in this world is not just about words, it is about balance, the space between characters, the pressure of each stroke. A letter written with grace could carry more weight in the Lord's eyes than 100 spoken sentences. The concubine practices her script, copying a classical poem about cherry blossoms and spring rain, each line flowing like a breath held and released. Nearby, a woman plays the kodo, the notes falling like drops of water into stillness, while two others speak softly over a board of black and white stones. In this room, conversation is careful, never too loud, never too direct. Every exchange is part of the silent network of relationships that shape life within the palace. At times, subtle alliances are formed here, in shared glances and small favors. At others, rivalries simmer beneath polite smiles. The concubine is skilled at navigating this terrain. She knows when to offer a compliment, when to remain silent, and when to let a question hang unanswered. The hours slip by in this gentle rhythm until a chime sounds from the corridor, signaling the arrival of tea. Two attendants enter, kneeling as they place trays of sweets and steaming bowls before each woman. The sweets are shaped like seasonal flowers: plum in winter, iris in spring, and the tea is whisked until a fine froth forms on its surface. The tea ceremony here is not the formal, public ritual known beyond the palace walls. It is a quieter, more intimate practice, yet still bound by rules. The concubine lifts her bowl with both hands, turns it slightly as tradition dictates, and drinks in 3 measured sips. Conversation softens during tea, as if the warmth of the drink draws each woman inward. When the tea is finished, the concubine returns to her chamber briefly. Escorted once again by her maid, there she finds a folded message waiting on her lacquered table. The seal bears the crest of one of the senior wives. The note is polite, but firm a request to join her in the garden pavilion at midday. Such an invitation is not optional. The concubine knows it could be a simple and social meeting, or it could carry the weight of something more. She changes into another kimono, lighter in color for the warmth of the day, the silk patterned with pale waves. The obi is tied higher, in a style that suggests elegance without ostentation. As she walks through the garden path toward the pavilion, she feels the eyes of attendants and other women on her, not openly hostile, but watchful. The pavilion stands by the edge of the pond, its open sides, allowing the breeze to carry the scent of water and pine. The senior wife is already there, seated on a cushion, her hair and robes immaculate, avore the shallow end of the pond, but soon shifts to more pointed matters. The senior wife inquires about the concubine's recent time with the Lord, about her interests in the arts, about her family. The questions are framed as casual, yet each one carries an undercurrent, as if she is weighing the concubine's place in the palace. The concubine answers with care, offering nothing that could be twisted into gossip, yet giving enough to show respect and attentiveness. The meeting lasts no more than half an hour, but it leaves her with the faint tension of someone who has walked across thin ice. Returning to her quarters, she sits quietly for a moment, letting the stillness settle back over her. Soon, the midday meal is served: rice, grilled fish, a small bowl of simmered vegetables, each dish arranged with a kind of precision that reflects the palace's order. She eats slowly, mindful of her posture, aware that mealtimes can be observed even when they feel private. After the meal, she is free for a short while. Some women use this time to nap. Others write letters or sew. The concubine chooses to walk in the garden, as her maid a few steps behind. The sun is warm on her sleeves, the air filled with the sound of a bamboo water spout filling and tipping, filling and tipping. She pauses to watch a dragonfly hover above the pond, its wings catching the light. This moment, fleeting and delicate, is one of the few times in her day where she feels the world beyond the palace. Yet even here, she is mindful of how she appears. Every step, every turn of the head, is part of the quiet performance that defines her life. As afternoon thins into the long hush before dusk, the palace changes its breathing. Servants move with swifter feet, lanterns are checked, oil refreshed. The faint clink of porcelain is swallowed by corridors as if the building itself were rehearsing the night. In her chamber, the concubine sits very still while her maid unrolls lacquered trays, combs, pins, tiny pots of color, an ordered constellation around the bronze mirror. Evening calls for decisions. Which silk? Which fragrance? What message should the layers whisper when she walks past a screen or bows before a doorway? She chooses a kimono, the color of riverlight at sunset, a muted blue with a vapor of silver herons stitched along the hem, quiet enough not to offend the principal wives, luminous enough to be remembered if remembered is safe. The obi is a dusk-gray brocade tied in a knot that sits slightly lower than fashion allows, a deliberate modesty that will read as discipline if anyone is taking notes. The notes are always being taken, though no brush touches paper. This is a house where eyes write what lips will never say. Hair is regathered and smoothed with camellia oil until it lies like midnight, a long, perfected arc held with tortoiseshell. Then a single pin of mother-of-pearl, one spark, no more. She inhales steam from a cup of roasted tea to steady the voice she may need to borrow later. Then practices the small things that make or unmake an hour. The depth of a bow to a senior wife, the angle of the wrist when accepting a cup from an attendant, the measured delay before answering a question that should not have been asked. By the time the sky has become a sheet of pale copper behind the pines, a messenger kneels at her threshold, forehead to the floor, and delivers a folded slip with the Lord's crest pressed faintly into the paper. The summons is neither urgent nor casual, which is to say, it is like every summons that matters. She follows the messenger through the cool corridors, light spilling in squares across the floor from lanterns half-shielded by painted screens, cranes, peonies, waves beauty placed like nets to catch the eye before it flies where it shouldn't. In the reception hall, the air is honeyed with agarwood and faint plum smoke from censers, and musicians sit in a shadowed line near the pillars, their shamisen and koto low against their knees, waiting for a glance from the steward. The Lord's advisors hover at the edges like careful shadows, and two principal wives are already seated, perfect in posture, wearing kimonos that speak the language of rank without raising their voice. She bows, enters the shallow current of the room, and becomes its temperature. A tray arrives clear sake in a thin cup that warms quickly between her hands. A crescent of pickled plum, a slice of pear set like a moon on porcelain small, minimalist planets orbiting a gravity invisible to the untrained eye. The Lord appears not like thunder, but like weather, at once everywhere and nowhere. His steps simple, the ripple they make complex. He speaks first of the garden, how the maples seem to prefer the northern shade this year, then of rains and river gates, and a stubborn magistrate who will not yield a warehouse lease near the harbor. This is court talk, and court talk is not idle. It requires answers that do not tilt the table, and she gives them with a softness that lets others write what they wish between her words. Later, when cups are refilled and the musicians draw a silk thread of sound across the dusk, the Lord asks for a poem, the steward's eyes lift, the wives become still as votives, and the concubine lowers her gaze to a place just above the tatami, a stage without boards, and recites a tanka she has practiced in silence for weeks, a handful of syllables arranged like stones in a stream. A lantern trembling, in wind that does not arrive. Koi disturbed the moon, one scale tipping the night's bowl, how quietly water breaks. The room exhales. The Lord smiles the kind of smile that binds and frees in the same breath, and a tiny jet of relief opens behind her ribs, then closes. Relief audible is naivete. Talk passes to music. To the matter of silk deliveries from the Western Road, to a visiting monk said to be able to write sutras with a brush of fox whisker so fine, the ink appears only when breathed upon. She listens the way a lake listens, surface placid, depths busy, with currents cataloging the names that repeat, the requests that hide inside praise, the agreements sealed with a silence more binding than ink. A wife speaks to her graciously, coolly about the flowers at the far gate, and in that 5-sentence weather report a winter is forecast for anyone who brings peonies instead of camellias next week. The concubine thanks her as if gifted a jewel. Warnings are jewels that do not glitter until the moon is gone. As the evening folds, attendants move like moths tending flame, placing fresh coals in braziers, relighting a wick that has leaned into ash, replacing a cup before thirst understands itself. The Lord withdraws to speak with two counselors by a painted screen of storm waves. The wives drift toward a side veranda where the night smells of cypress. The concubine is asked softly, formally, to perform one song. She takes the shamisen, bows to the instrument as to a senior, and lets her fingers find the story of a fisherman who dreamed of catching the reflection of the moon, bringing home a brightness he could not sell. The room tunes itself to the tale. The last note hangs like a swallow under eaves, then disappears into the architecture. There are nights when the summons ends here, and there are nights when it is a prelude. This is one that does not say, a maid who belongs to the steward's household appears at her shoulder with a message braided into courtesy. The Lord wishes for poetry again. Later, in the smaller pavilion near the plum trees, not a command, not a question, a weather pattern. She bows, accepts, and in the space between bow and breath rearranges the map of the next hours. The smaller pavilion is a place of nearness to tatami, still warm from the day. A low table set for two with inkstone, brush, and paper, as if conversation might need to become visible. The Lord arrives with the unhurried certainty of someone for whom doors have always opened before knuckles consider knocking. He pours sake for them both, a gesture that is either intimacy or experiment. The difference is often discovered in retrospect. He asks about her morning, what character she practiced in calligraphy, which verse she copied, and when she answers, he asks why that verse and not its twin, and in this second question a bridge appears, a passage from performance to self. The concubine chooses her steps like a traveler crossing river stones in fog. She speaks of restraint as a fragrance stronger than abundance, of how the shadow a branch casts on shoji tells more truth than the branch itself, and he studies the place her voice comes from, not the words. They write 3 lines together on a single sheet. He begins, she continues, he ends, ink feathering slightly at the edges, a weather map of 2 minds, negotiating pressure and pause. Wind bends the plum boughs, and the night loosens its knot. A tray arrives with warm towels, a tiny dish of salted persimmon, and a bowl of clear broth that tastes like the absence of noise. The Lord sets his cup down with the gentlest click, the sound of a door closing without closing, and says there will be a trip to the villa by the river when the tides are kinder. He will require readings from a book that lives in the library's 2nd room, 3rd shelf, tales of warriors who chose to lose so their lords might win. What does she think of losing well? She answers that some defeats are disguises that never wish to be unmasked, and the corner of his mouth lifts danger, admiration. Either can wear that cloak. When the lantern dwindles and the watch bell marks a late hour, protocol gathers itself. She bows, not deeply deep is for ceremony. This is for breath, and withdraws along a corridor where the cedar boards remember every foot that has ever crossed them. Her maid meets her halfway, absorbent of news without asking. Back in her chamber, the night folds her like cloth. The ornaments come out of her hair one by one with the click of small moons returning to a drawer. The obi relaxes. The silk breathes as if it too had been performing. The maid wipes away the rice powder with warmed water scented faintly of yuzu peel, a fragrance that makes the room feel larger, then smaller, then precisely the size of a human being lying down. Before sleep, there is the ledger only she reads unwritten, kept beneath the ribs, today's entries. A wife's warning about flowers, the steward's new habit of standing with his left foot turned outward when uncertain, the Lord's question about losing, the map of who sat where and who avoided whose eyes. She files them in the archive behind her heartbeat. This is how she survives. Not by winning, but by remembering who needs to believe that they did. Outside, the garden resets to its midnight grammar cricket, bamboo dipper, a fish turning once and translating moonlight into rings. She thinks of home, which is no longer a place, but a set of voices, of a mother's hands that smelled of rice and rain, of a sister who laughed too loudly for this corridor, of a father who told her that being still is not the same as being small. A draft tests the shoji and fails. The lamp expires into a soft bruise of smoke. The concubine lies on her side, a careful comma between day and day, and lets the palace drift past her like a riverboat's lanterns near, then gone until the sleep that belongs to those who must wake flawless arrives without footsteps. Before dawn has fully decided itself, the palace inhales thin, cool air creeping along the floorboards, and she is awake again, not from a bell or a voice, but from the discipline that has learned to rise before sound. The night's lacquer has not yet cracked into morning, and the paper screens are still a pale slate. Somewhere a guard coughs into his sleeve. Somewhere a monk, housed for a week as a guest, turns a page with the hush of a moth's wing. She sits up, palms on the futon, and inventories the body she wears for other people. Shoulders unknotted, hair sleeping tame, breath even. The maid enters with a lantern trimmed small, as if light must ask permission. She lays out the basin, the towel warmed over coals, The tiny bowl of powdered incense the concubine will touch to her wrists, for water has erased the map of yesterday. The morning robe is unambitious, a cloud color, innocent of embroidery because ambition is a thing to be worn in the mind. Never on sleeves, not at this hour. She washes, smooths the skin with the edge of a cloth until it answers back, and in the mirror's bronze pond studies the residue of last night's conversation. The Lord's question about losing, the way the word villa tasted like a stretched string, the fact that when he poured sake for them both, his wrist moved, as if weighing rain. There is time, as always, for practice an hour that looks like quiet but is actually scaffolding. She kneels at the low desk and grinds ink in slow circles on the stone until the water blackens into something with gravity. On fresh paper, she traces characters that belong to a sutra. The visiting monk recited at dusk. Patience is a gate that does not swing but opens more the longer you look at it. Stroke. Pause. Breathe. Stroke. The maid hums almost inaudibly as she oils the combs, and the room's geometry becomes kind brush, stone, lamp, her reflection 4 points stitching her to this morning like a sail to its mast. Lessons will follow. The steward's wife has asked for a reading of an old tale of courtly deceit to be performed in the library for 2 adolescents of the household whose tongues run faster than their discernment. The principal wife has asked for floral consultation camellia, not peony, for an offering. The scribe who hates to leave his desk will require her presence to select a seal for a letter that pretends to be about rice allocations, but is actually about the rank of a cousin. She dresses for utility that can pass as grace, inner layers like unsaid apologies, an outer kimono of river stone green, sleeves short enough not to drown her hands when she pours, long enough to allow the suggestion that nothing here is accidental. Breakfast arrives with the sun's first rehearsal rice that looks like snow collected in a bowl, a ribbon of grilled eel lacquered to mirror the sky it will never return to, pickled plum that wakes the mouth into honesty. She eats slowly, letting hunger end before the last grains end, a lesson from an old nurse. Leave something on the plate for the day to eat if the day gets hungry for you. The garden is a page erased and rewritten in frost. Breath shows itself, then regrets it. 2 herons stand like thoughts too large to share. Along the covered walk she meets the librarian, who bows as if folding himself into a drawer, and in his arms are scrolls he cannot admit are heavy. She takes one, which is both permission and flattery, and together they move like a polite storm toward the room that smells of cedar and dusts patience. The library is a ship moored in dry air. Shelves hold oceans. The table is tide. The youths arrive with faces that have never yet been punished by consequence, accompanied by a tutor who survives his profession by moving only his eyebrows. She unrolls the tale. A minister who buys loyalty with silence, a lady who solves a war with a misdelivered poem, a servant who knows everything but keeps it. The city saved not by swords but by the right word arriving in the right throat at the right time. She reads without theatricality, the calm pulse of syllables teaching itself to be remembered. At the end, she asks nothing, explains nothing. And because no question was asked, the boys must speak first. And in speaking, they hear the gaps in what they think they understood. When they leave, the tutor bows with an extra vertebrae of respect. The librarian courageous in the way quiet men are asks if she has ever seen the moon from the roof. She smiles the answer that says both yes and no, and he understands that roofs are not always places but permissions. The floral consultation is next. In the east corridor, the principal wife waits with a tray of porcelain frogs. They're green glazed into permanence. A private joke about rain. The arrangement must please a god who prefers restraint and a husband who prefers to believe that restraint is his idea. They discuss stem length, the weight of white space in a vase, the way a single leaf can be the difference between a prayer and a performance. The concubine suggests three camellias facing slightly away from one another, as if listening to something the room cannot hear. The wife nods once, the movement of a small bell ringing somewhere improbable. Then to the physician's room, because health inside a palace is not only the absence of illness, but the choreography of being seen to be well. The physician smells of chrysanthemum and old paper. He inquires about sleep, about appetite, about the tempers of the season. He checks the color beneath her nails as if reading footnotes. He prescribes nothing but a walk. At the hour when the sun forgets it is winter, and remembers it is, light advice that is medicine disguised as kindness. Before noon, there is the embroidery quarter, where the air is busy with discipline. Women bend over silk like astronomers mapping constellations you can touch. She sits with them not to sew, though she can, but to be threaded into the tapestry of their talk, which is safer than the talk of corridors because it has needles in it. Here she collects the tiny brightnesses that light a day later when needed. A cook's niece saw a courier from the Western Road hand, a letter to the steward behind the screen of the bamboo grove, and a gate guard has taken to gambling on cricket fights, which is interesting because men who love small battles are useful in larger ones. A cartwheel squealed at the back gate before dawn, so either a delivery arrived unscheduled or someone desired the sound of arrival without the burden of being seen arriving. She files these stars in the sky inside her ribs, arranging them into shapes that may become directions. The summons that finds her just as bells admit midday is not from the Lord, not from a wife, but from the old calligraphy master who taught her once a winter ago to put her breath where the stroke will land. He sits in a room that has been empty of noise for a long time. He pours tea so pale it feels like remembering water. He asks to see the sutra character she practiced. She shows him. He corrects not the strokes, but the spaces, touching the air above the paper as if tuning wind. "Leave more unsaid," he says, "so that the gods have somewhere to sit." She bows as if receiving a map. He adds without looking at her that words are doors but also walls, and that she will need both before the plum trees open. She understands that this is either prophecy or pedagogy, and that in this house the difference is only revealed by hindsight. When she stands to leave, he places near her sleeve an inkstick flecked with gold dust, the kind used for letters that must be seen even in dim rooms. "For nights when light forgets you," he says, and she carries the gift as if it were fragile time. Noon spills into the long afternoon, and she returns to her chamber to change the outer layer. Winter sun has warmed to the color of steamed rice, and the green she wears needs a companion. She chooses a hari, the shade of smoked tea, stitches of pale thread drawing reeds near an invisible river. The maid approves with silence. There will be a small audience in the West Hall, where a visiting lute player from the southern provinces will perform songs that smell of salt and distance. The concubine is expected to attend, to be delighted enough to be remembered, but not enough to be rumored. She is good at that middle delight that behaves. On the way she passes the steward, standing with his left foot turned outward, the posture of uncertainty she catalogued last night, and he looks as if he has been given a box that makes a noise but will not open. She bows precisely a breath deeper than custom, and in the seam of that courtesy he exhales, which means he has chosen to trust her with a thing he hasn't decided to say yet. Later, perhaps. The West Hall is a shell cupped around sound. The musician plays a piece in which every return is not a return, only a different road to the same shore. The Lord is not present. 2 wives are. 3 minor officials pretend they do not love music. At the end, the player's last note does not end. It evaporates. The room practices gratitude, as if gratitude were calligraphy. When the audience disperses, a parchment finds her hand a discreet square with a seal that is not the Lord's, not the steward's one. She recognizes as belonging to a clan to whom rain is currency, and whose daughters braid messages into their hair. The note contains only a poem about tide and silt and a boat that forgets its oars, But the character for silt has been written with the smallest hesitation at its root, the signal that means delay. She folds the poem into the sleeve that faces her heart. The villa by the river may not want visitors when the river does not want boats. By the time afternoon lowers its voice, she has completed a circuit of usefulness so seamless it leaves no prince readings and arrangements, the physician's questions, a lesson she did not know she needed, a music that decided to be weather, a letter that pretended to be a poem. She returns to her room for the hour that is neither day nor evening, the hour that belongs to decision without announcement. The maid lays out two possible futures in silk, one for a night of court, one for a night of pages and pencil. She chooses neither yet, sits at the low desk, and writes 3 versions of the same thank you note, one to the principal wife for the camellia correction, one to the librarian for the library's mercy, one to the old master for the inkstick that will be light when light goes elsewhere. Each is a different river finding the same sea. Each says less than it means, and more than it says, outside. A wind auditions for evening. Bamboo practices its bowing. Somewhere a bell counts to 5. The day will ask again very soon watch. At kind of night she plans to survive. But for the length of a single, carefully poured breath, she is only a woman with ink on her fingers, a sleeve warmed by a hidden poem, and a spine held straight by promises that are not yet due. The late afternoon in the palace is a time when the shadows begin to stretch across the courtyards, when the sunlight takes on a warmer hue, gilding the edges of tiled roofs and filtering through the pines and slanted beams that dance across the gravel paths. For the concubine, these hours are not a period of rest, but of quiet preparation. Her duties may shift from the open garden and social encounters toward the private and the ceremonial. She returns to her chamber where the air is cooler, shaded by the sliding panels drawn halfway closed. The maid kneels to place a fresh pot of tea beside her, the steam curling upward in delicate ribbons before dissolving into the stillness. There is a subtle rhythm to the palace at this hour, the shuffle of sandals as attendants move between rooms, the distant ring of a bell signaling the hour, the muffled laughter from a corner where younger servants gather. It is a time when small messages are delivered discreetly, folded into fans or tucked into the sleeves of a robe. The concubine spends a short while reviewing her appearance, smoothing the silk of her kimono, checking the arrangement of her hairpins so they catch the light without seeming gaudy. These details matter not just for beauty, but as a signal to those who see her that she understands her place and its expectations. Soon, a soft knock at the panel brings word from a senior attendant. The Lord will dine in the small audience hall tonight, and her presence is requested. Such summons are always given with formality, yet they are never entirely routine. She nods in acknowledgement, her expression composed, though her heart picks up its pace. The hours leading to such an occasion must be used with care. Her maid selects a formal kimono from the lacquered chest, a rich, deep blue patterned with cranes in flight, the silk heavy yet fluid in movement. The obi is broad and stiff, tied in an intricate knot that requires skill and precision, and scented with a faint trace of plum blossom. Once dressed, she kneels at her low mirror stand, applying a light touch of powder to her face, a hint of red to her lips, and just enough ink to define her brows. The transformation is subtle, but deliberate, a blend of modesty and allure that aligns with the court's ideal of refined beauty. As the sun dips lower, painting the sky in muted gold and soft lavender, she is escorted along the covered walkway toward the audience hall. The sound of her footsteps on the polished wood merges with the distant murmur of voices from within. Stepping inside, she bows low, her gaze lowered in respect, then takes her place among a small group of guests. The room smells faintly of cedar and incense, the tatami mats freshly brushed. In the center, a low lacquered table has been set with trays of seasonal dishes, delicate slices of sashimi arranged like petals, simmered vegetables in small porcelain bowls, and steaming miso soup whose aroma mingles with that of freshly grilled fish. The Lord enters shortly after. Dressed in formal robes of understated elegance, his hair tied high, his expression calm but commanding, those present bow again, the air shifting slightly as attention focuses on him. The meal begins in near silence, broken only by the gentle clink of chopsticks and the occasional soft-spoken remark. Here, words are chosen with care, idle chatter is rare, and each comment is measured for its effect. The concubine answers when addressed, offering small observations about the flavor of a dish or the beauty of the garden seen earlier that day. The Lord's responses are equally restrained, but a glint of approval in his eyes tells her she has spoken well. At moments, she catches the sidelong glances of others, some curious, some assessing each interaction in this setting, is part of an unspoken conversation of influence and favor. As the meal progresses, wine is poured in shallow cups, its surface reflecting the glow of the lanterns. The warmth of the drink spreads slowly, loosening the stiffness of posture, allowing for a more fluid exchange of words. After the final dish is cleared, the group moves to a side chamber where musicians play the shamisen and koto, their melodies weaving a soft tapestry of sound. Here, the concubine's role shifts again. She listens intently, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze attentive yet demure. When invited, she joins in a quiet game of poetry, where each participant must add a verse to complete a poem begun by another. Her verse, drawn from a memory of spring rain on temple eaves, earns a nod of appreciation from the Lord, a subtle victory in the delicate economy of court life. As the evening winds down, the guests depart in pairs or alone, each bowing deeply before leaving. The concubine returns to her chamber through lantern-lit corridors, the night air cool against her face. The palace at night feels different, quieter, the sounds more pronounced, the flicker of light and shadow more intimate. Inside her room, she removes the formal kimono, folding it carefully, then loosens her hair so it falls down her back in a dark, smooth curtain. The maid brings a basin of warm water for her to wash her hands and face, the heat a gentle contrast to the chill beyond the paper walls. She sits for a time by the small brazier, hands wrapped around a final cup of tea, letting the events of the evening settle in her mind. In the distance, a night watchman's wooden clappers mark the passing hours. Soon, she will lie down on her futon, the scent of plum blossom from her obi still lingering faintly in the air. But before she closes her eyes, she knows that tomorrow will bring its own summons, its own small tests, and its own quiet victories in the intricate, unending dance of life within the palace. Night in the palace unfolds with a quiet that is never truly still. For even in the deepest hours there is movement, a pulse beneath the silence that keeps the great wooden halls alive. The concubine lies for a time in her chamber, eyes half open, listening. From far down the corridor comes the measured tread of the night watchman, his wooden clappers striking together in a slow, steady rhythm, a sound meant to reassure, yet one that reminds all within these walls that the palace must be guarded even against unseen dangers. Beyond the thin paper screens, the garden is washed in pale moonlight, the outlines of pine and cherry trees softened to ink-brush shadows, their leaves whispering faintly with each breath of the wind. In the stillness, she can smell the faint sharpness of the brazier's charcoal, the lingering sweet trace of incense burned earlier in the evening, and the subtle perfume of her own hair oil. The futon beneath her is warm, the quilt light yet insulating, and the texture of the cotton sheet against her fingertips is soft enough to be felt even without conscious thought. Though the formalities of the evening have passed, her mind is not entirely at rest, for life in the court is a constant balance of repose and readiness. She remembers the glance of another concubine at dinner, the slight, almost imperceptible tightening of the lips, a gesture that might mean rivalry or nothing at all yet in this world. Every gesture has weight. Shifting slightly, she turns to face the screen where a square of moonlight has fallen. the pale glow outlining the faint grain of the paper. Time passes slowly in this posture, each heartbeat measured against the distant drip of water in the courtyard cistern. At last, she sits up, sliding open the panel just enough to admit a thread of cool air, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and night-blooming flowers. The moon hangs low and round above the tiled roofs, its light silvering the edges of the eaves and catching on the curve of the stone lanterns below. She watches for a while, letting her thoughts drift to memories of the world beyond the palace walls, the narrow streets of her home district, the sound of market traders calling their wares, the rough weave of everyday clothing before the silks and brocades of court life became her constant skin. Those memories feel distant now, as though belonging to another life entirely. Closing the panel again, she pours a small cup of tea from the pot kept warm on the brazier stand, the liquid dark and fragrant, the steam rising in delicate swirls. She drinks slowly, the heat spreading through her chest, and feels her muscles begin to loosen. From somewhere nearer, a soft rustle catches her ear, the shuffle of fabric against tatami, perhaps a servant passing quietly on some late errand. Such sounds are neither unusual nor alarming, yet they remind her that solitude in the palace is never absolute. When at last she lies down again, the shadows in the room have shifted, the moonlight now angled differently across the floor. The quilt is drawn up to her chin, and her eyes close, not all at once but in stages, each breath pulling her deeper into the slow current of sleep. The dreams that come are not vivid but muted, colored in soft grays and faded golds, echoing the rhythms of the day just past. A sound in the distance, the sharp crack of wood against wood, rouses her briefly. The night watchman again marking the hour. She turns over, feeling the cool side of the pillow against her cheek, and slips once more into the drifting quiet. When dawn begins to seep into the palace, it does so not with a sudden flood, but with a gradual lifting of shadow, a graying of the S that turns to pale blue as the first cries of the crows rise from the garden. The concubine wakes to this light, her eyes opening on the familiar pattern of the ceiling beams, the faint scent of morning air replacing the heavier perfume of the night. The brazier has cooled, its embers dull, and the tea in the pot is cold. She rises slowly, folding her quilt and placing it neatly aside, then slides open the panel to let in the fresh air. Outside, the garden glistens with dew, each droplet catching the new sunlight like a bead of glass. Attendants are already moving through the walkways, their soft voices carrying news of the day's duties. She washes her face in the basin brought by her maid, the chill of the water waking her fully, then sits before the mirror to draw her hair back into its morning arrangement. The weight of the day's tasks begins to settle upon her, but so too does the quiet discipline of routine. Another day in the palace has begun, and with it the unending cycle of watchfulness, grace, and the silent contest for favor that shapes every moment of her existence. Morning in the palace begins before the sun has fully claimed the horizon, a slow unwinding of shadow and silence, the faint blue of dawn seeping through the shoji screens like the breath of some sleeping giant. The concubine wakes to the muted clatter of wooden buckets in the courtyard, the soft thud of sandals on tatami, and the low murmur of attendants exchanging words too brief and clipped to catch. Her maid kneels beside her with the morning basin, steam rising faintly from the warm water, the scent of hinoki wood drifting upward as she rinses her face, the chill of wakefulness mingling with the comfort of ritual. Hair is combed in long, deliberate strokes, the teeth of the comb gliding through with a sound like rain over roof tiles, each movement pulling her from the haze of sleep into the sharp clarity of the day ahead. The garments laid out are lighter than the layered robes of night, yet no less precise each fold, each tie an emblem of the discipline that shapes life here. Beyond the walls, the crows call in rough voices from the eaves, their cries mingling with the distant toll of the temple bell. a reminder that the world beyond the palace stirs even as this enclosed realm follows its own rhythm. She kneels before a low lacquered table where the morning meal is set. A small bowl of rice, miso soup flecked with scallions, pickled vegetables arranged with deliberate asymmetry, and a single grilled fish whose skin gleams in the first touch of light. She eats slowly, mindful of the quiet dignity expected at every moment, even in solitude. From somewhere deep within the palace, a gong sounds low, resonant, calling the household to readiness for the day's first audience. Word passes swiftly among the women. The Lord will appear in the main hall, receiving both courtiers and selected companions. A ritual of presence as much as politics. Such occasions are rare enough to draw every eye and quicken every pulse. For a glance, a word, even the faintest smile from him can shift the delicate balance of favor within these walls. She moves with the others through the covered walkways, the polished wood cool beneath her feet, the air rich with the scent of fresh tatami and camellia oil used to dust the railings. The morning light falls in angled beams across the gardens, illuminating the damp moss and the still surface of the pond where koi drift lazily beneath the shadow of the bridge. In the great hall, the women take their places according to rank, each bow calculated in depth and duration, the rustle of silk robes filling the air like the wings of hidden birds. The sliding doors part, and he enters not hurried, not slow, but with a measured grace that bends the room's atmosphere toward him. His robes are dark, embroidered with threads that catch the light like water, and his hair is bound high, the glint of a hairpin at his temple. His eyes pass over the assembly, pausing on no one for long, yet each woman who meets his gaze feels the weight of that fleeting moment. He takes his place on the raised dais, the attendants kneeling at either side, and the audience begins. Petitions from minor nobles, reports from messengers, the recitation of seasonal poetry meant to flatter both ear and intellect. She watches, her face composed, her mind attentive, knowing that even in stillness she is observed, that any sign of distraction could be a seed of gossip by nightfall. When the formalities end, he rises and departs with the same quiet authority, leaving behind a trail of held breaths and quickened thoughts. The women disperse in small groups, their conversations low and veiled, each parsing the unspoken meanings of the morning. She returns to her quarters, the echo of his presence lingering like the aftertaste of strong tea, both bitter and compelling. After the morning audience, the palace does not quiet. It only changes its tone. The measured formality dissolves into 1,000 small currents of motion and sound, like a river splitting into hidden channels beneath the surface. The concubine walks slowly along the covered gallery, her footsteps soft against the polished wood, yet her senses alive to every detail, the whisper of two attendants pausing mid-sentence as she passes, the faint scent of plum blossoms drifting from the inner courtyard, the distant clink of porcelain from a tea service being prepared. This is the hour when alliances are built in silence, when the day's balance of favor begins to tilt on the edge of gestures so slight they could be missed if one were not watching. In the garden, groups of women stroll among the winding paths, their conversation a veil over sharper intentions, fans opening and closing in patterns that seem idle but carry meaning for those who understand them. A glance toward the koi pond might signal curiosity. A hand resting too long on a sleeve might speak of a warning. She takes a seat beneath the shade of a maple tree, the dappled light falling across her robes, and listens not to the words themselves but to the rhythms, the pauses, the changes in tone that betray the truth beneath polite phrases. An older concubine with lacquer black hair leans close, murmuring something about a visiting noble from the western provinces, his offering to the Lord, the subtle competition it will spark. Across the garden, another woman receives a folded letter from an attendant, slipping it into her sleeve with the ease of one accustomed to secrets. The concubine sips her tea slowly, the bitterness blooming across her tongue, and wonders what messages are carried within these walls today. which will vanish into silence, and which will emerge to shape tomorrow's order. The air grows warmer, and the palace breathes with it, the corridors alive with the shuffle of slippers, the swish of silk, the soft closing of sliding doors. She moves toward the calligraphy hall, where a few women practice under the eye of a court tutor, the black ink glistening on fresh paper, each stroke deliberate yet capable of carrying more than just the words written. Here, too, messages can be hidden, a change in style or subject serving as a quiet declaration. Her own brush moves with practiced grace, writing a verse about spring rain, knowing it will be seen and perhaps interpreted by more than the tutor later. She retreats to her quarters, greeted by the scent of freshly replenished incense, the faint trace of sandalwood curling in the still air. Her maid places a small lacquered box before her, a gift, wrapped in deep crimson cloth, no name attached. She unties it carefully, revealing a hair ornament of worked silver, its shape a delicate crane mid-flight. Such a gift could be a token of admiration, or a test, or both. She turns it in her hands, the metal cool against her skin, the meaning uncertain but undeniable, somewhere beyond the walls of her room. Laughter rings briefly, sharp and bright, before fading into the hush. She knows that in this place, joy is as calculated as sorrow, that every smile might hide a blade. As the afternoon light shifts, casting longer shadows through the shoji, she feels the invisible lines drawing tighter between the women, each step and word pulling them closer to or farther from the center of favor. The Lord is unseen now, but his presence is everywhere, woven into the ambitions, the rivalries, the delicate theater that plays out in every corner. By the time the sun has lowered toward the horizon, the palace has shifted again, the brightness of day giving way to a softer, more deliberate rhythm, as if every movement now is slowed not by weariness, but by anticipation. Word has spread that tonight the Lord will host a small evening gathering, not the grand banquets reserved for seasonal festivals, but something more intimate, more selective. Such occasions are rare, and every woman who receives the summons understands the weight it carries. In her chamber, the concubine sits before the mirror of polished bronze, the reflected image slightly warped, but still enough to show the careful work of her maid's hands. Layer upon layer of silk is arranged around her, an underrobe of pale cream, a middle layer of indigo, the outer robe, a deep, almost black green embroidered with threads of gold that catch the lamplight like fireflies trapped in the weave. Her hair is bound high, a cascade of glossy black falling over her shoulders, held in place with pins of carved ivory. The scent of camellia oil lingers in the air, mingling with the faint smoke of incense curling from the brazier. Outside, the corridors are quieter than usual, the shuffle of feet muted, voices hushed, the palace holding its breath. As she walks toward the great hall, her footsteps echo in the long gallery, the faint sound of music shames and strings, and the deep pulse of a drum growing clearer with each step. Entering the hall, she sees the guests already gathered. The Lord seated at the head, his posture relaxed yet unyielding, his gaze attentive but unreadable. To his right, a visiting envoy from the northern provinces speaks in low tones, his words punctuated by the occasional nod from their host. To the left, two concubines pour sake, their movements precise, the pale liquid catching the light as it streams into lacquered cups. She takes her place among the others, bowing low, her eyes lowered until acknowledged. When she looks up, she catches his gaze for the briefest moment, and in that heartbeat the noise of the room seems to fade, the air between them charged with something unspoken. The entertainment begins. A dancer moves across the polished floor, her sleeves trailing like waves, her steps so light they seem to leave no mark, her face serene yet distant. The music swells and softens, the scent of warm sake and grilled river fish filling the air, the flicker of candlelight making the shadows on the walls dance like living things. Conversations weave and separate, laughter mingling with the gentle clink of porcelain, and then without warning a small commotion at the far end of the hall. One of the servants has stumbled, the tray slipping from her hands, cups shattering against the floor. The sound is sharp, jarring, and for a moment, all eyes turn toward the source. The servant kneels, bowing deeply, stammering apologies, but the Lord's gaze lingers on her with a stillness that feels heavier than anger. The tension hums in the air, and though the incident is quickly resolved, it leaves a subtle shift in the atmosphere. When the evening ends, the concubine walks back through the dim corridors, the paper lanterns casting pools of light along the way. The sound of her own breath is loud in her ears, and she wonders not for the first time how quickly fortune can change here, how a single misstep, even one not your own, can alter the currents that decide your place. In her chamber, she removes the hairpins one by one, setting them carefully beside the mirror, each soft click on the lacquered surface like the closing of a door. The night beyond the shoji is still, but inside, the quiet is full of thoughts that will not rest. Morning arrives not like forgiveness, but like a record being unrolled again, line by line, the pale light threading through the shoji and writing itself across the tatami, where her shadow begins as a thin brushstroke and thickens into certainty. She wakes to the smell of cool water in the basin and faint ash from the brazier that dozed to a red eyelid during the night. Her maid, already kneeling, offers the towel warmed over coals, and the cloth feels like a small, obedient sun as it touches cheek and brow. The world outside is rinsed in brisk crows arguing from the cypress, a gardener's rake whispering in gravel, a temple bell from beyond the outer wall, carrying a calm that will not cross the threshold, but inside the women's quarter the air is strung tight as a shamisen, because accidents are never only accidents here. Cups broke last night, a porcelain like small moons shattered underfoot, and the sound still hangs in the wood. The servant's bow had cleaved the room like a blade, the Lord's silence heavier than punishment, and everyone woke already, deciding what story that silence wanted to hear. She dresses in mourning layers that say diligence without hunger, inner linen the color of rice steam, a light gray kimono printed with reeds so pale they appear only when she moves, obi of muted persimmon tied low, not to intrude upon anyone's mood, then sits before the bronze mirror's patient lake and arranges hair with the measured generosity taught by women who survived a dozen seasons of favor and drought alike. A single pin of horn, no bright stones. Because today brilliance would be a rumor you started about yourself. Breakfast is ceremonial humility, miso pricked with scallion, rice laid like snow that remembers it was rain, a slice of pickled turnip crisp as a new thought. She eats with the same rhythm as copying a sutra, and while the chopsticks transfer small, exact portions, she runs the ledger of the night in her mind. Where the envoy sat, how far the dancer kept from the Lord's sleeve. The servant's left hand clenched even after the tray was gone, the principal wife's glance sliding toward the steward at the sound of breaking. Did her look arrive a heartbeat too fast? As if she had been waiting for a reason to measure him? The gong licks the hallways into order. An announcement spreads, not shouted, simply appearing in the air the way incense does. An inquiry will be held about the disturbance. The steward will listen in the maple pavilion. Attendance to be questioned, the presence required of those named by the night guard's list. Inquiries here are not trials, but mirrors angled, so the sun falls where someone did not say to you. Before that, there is purification. She walks with two other women to the small inner shrine where water runs over a stone lip into a trough, the color of old bronze, cold sluices over wrists, neck, the hollow at the throat. The priest's apprentice intones syllables that feel like the grain of cedar under the palm. She leaves a camellia bud, unblossomed, because this morning is about restraint, not spectacle, and she whispers a wish not for innocence, but for clarity, which is the more difficult talisman. In the calligraphy room, the old master waits with his thin cloud of tea. He taps the paper once, a sound like a sparrow's toe, and asks her to write the character for fall 3 ways: accident, season, and grace. Her brush finds the first with too much muscle, the second with too much sorrow, the third with a breath that lands lightly and holds, and he nods, not praise, not comfort, just the hinge of a door that opens into the rest of the day. Corridors thrum with whispered arithmetic: who spoke to whom, who arrived early to be seen as loyal, who arrived late to be seen as calm. Beneath it, a courier slides through like a fish through reeds, a narrow tube of bamboo tucked into his sleeve, and the steward's left foot, when she glimpses him across the courtyard, is turned outward again, a compass that cannot agree with itself. The maple pavilion is a bowl of shade rimmed by light, tatami newly brushed rays of faint, clean scent. The steward sits with a ledger and a teacup that he never drinks from. 2 scribes kneel at his flanks like quiet punctuation. The first attendants, questioned, tremble, but not with guilt here. People fear being misread more than being wrong. When it is her turn, she bows to the exact height humility wears when it is innocent, and when asked where she sat, what she saw, whether the servant stumbled before the envoy mentioned the salt in the fish, whether sake was poured from the left or right, she answers in a time signature that allows the truth to breathe. She saw sleeves, lacquer, light on a cup's rim. The servant's eyes fixed on a point that was not the floor. A hand that tried to save the tray after it had already chosen to fall. She does not offer a villain, only a sequence, and the steward listens as if the paper might bruise. When he thanks her, his voice is a robe turned inside out. She can see the stitching. Released from the pavilion's mild gravity, she walks the long gallery where the garden shows its anatomy. Pine bones, pebble skin, water for a pulse. An older concubine falls into step beside her, a woman whose smile is a set of tools. She mentions, as if discussing the weather, that the servant came from the kitchen clan, allied with the Western Gate captain, and that the envoy's retinue entered not by the main approach, but the storeroom corridor, which is the kind of fact that will bloom into meaning if kept warm. The principal wife requests her presence for tea noon-sharp courtesy, and they sit with a view of nothing but raked gravel, a discipline for the eyes. The cups are thin enough to tremble when set down. The wife speaks of a scroll restoration, of the need for a hand steady enough to reattach silk to silk, then places a hair ornament on the tray between them, silver crane mid-flight. A gift came to you, she says without saying it is the same, and the concubine lets the crane be a reflection, not a confession. The wife's mouth has the smallest fatigue at its corner, not from age, but from calculation. The river villa may be delayed, she adds, almost absent, and the word delayed lands like a feather with a hidden needle. The poem in her sleeve yesterday had already warned her tide and silt and oars forgotten, so she only nods, keeping the sea out of her eyes. Midday arrives, with a soundless swell bowls, steam, fish skin lacquered to memory. In the embroidery quarter, she lets thread go through silk the way time goes through a room, listening while needles talk. From this fabric of voices, she harvests 3 careful strands. The night guard who marked the hour of the break had been moved to the plum gate a week ago for angering the warehouse clerk. A lacquer tray with a shallow warp was returned to the scullery 2 days prior. A dancer has a brother who gambles on cricket fights with the same guard who hears too much. She does not knot these threads together, yet good nets are woven loosely first. Afternoon melts along the veranda. A maid from the steward's house appears with a request, a reading later. Private, a sutra about intention and mistake, perhaps to be copied in the small library where sunlight goes to think. Before that, the physician wants to see her again, which means someone has told him to make concern visible. He reads her pulse as if translating weather, prescribes roasted barley tea and the short walk just before dusk when lanterns are lit and shadows learn their lines. She thanks him for the theater of his kindness. The librarian, generous sadness in his eye, as always, produces a scroll whose edges have learned patience. Together they recite the sutra's stanza in which a bowl broken becomes 2 bowls of reflection if you set them in water. She copies the characters slowly, ink sinking into the paper like footprints that do not intend to dry. When she finishes, the steward is there, no foot turned outward now, both planted as if the earth has signed a treaty with him, and he asks, almost conversational, whether she believes a misstep can be a message. She answers that corridors often speak through feet when mouths are busy elsewhere. He smiles without teeth and leaves a small weight on the table. A seal with a camellia, carved so finely its petals seem to breathe. For your notes, he says, as if notes were something women are permitted to own. By late afternoon, the inquiry ends with no proclamation, which is to say the decision will be made where the floorboards know it, but the air never hears it. And the servant will not be seen for some days. Rumors will take her place at chores. The envoy's retinue will be served from trays, checked by hands that have names written on doors. The lord does not appear, which increases his size. The principal wife orders camellias cut with stems exact as a line of verse and sends them to the inner shrine. The concubine folds the sutra copy and feels the gold-flecked inkstick in her sleeve wait like a small promise she hasn't made yet. Evening rehearses itself in the corridor, lanterns being breathed into light, sandals announcing the hour up to the threshold, and then becoming quiet so as not to frighten the tea. Her maid lays 2 possibilities across the tatami indigo, with the pawn stitched in thread the color of lullabies, or ash brown, with reeds that refuse to bow, and she chooses ash brown because today reeds should appear to learn without agreeing. She pins her hair with horn again, leaves the silver crane sleeping in its cloth. She visits the small plum pavilion where the lord sometimes reads the news of his own house written in the way people stand, and finds only the paw print of a cat in the dust on the sill, which means the night will be kinder than the day. A messenger finally slips through with the soft authority of someone sent by tide itself. The river villa is postponed, waters sulk, the boatman refuses the moon's timetable. She receives the delay as one receives rain without argument, already translating it into changed trunks and other shoes. At supper, she says little, listens much. A junior concubine complains too smoothly about a seamstress, an error crafted to be overheard and adopted. The concubine lets the complaint pass through her like smoke through silk, no smell, no stain. Later, in the music room, the visiting lute player plucks a scale that remembers last night but decides not to tell it. She requests a tune about clear water over dark stones. And when the last note slips off the string, it lands where her worry was, and sits there politely until it fades, night uncurls, and she walks the outer veranda the physician recommended. The garden speaks in its night language, bamboo knocking gently like neighbors, a single frog with the confidence to be chorus and solo, water repeating itself because it is the only honest thing. She thinks of loss as a shape you can pour into different vessels until it becomes their shape and forgets its own. She thinks of the servant's clenched left hand, of the steward's seal, of the principal wife's cornered mouth. She thinks, and then she stops, because thought must not be allowed to chew through the rope that holds the boat. Back in her room, the maid unthreads the day pins to tray, obi to chest, powder to cloth, breadth to length. The bronze mirror returns her to being only a face attached to a spine that has not yet asked for mercy. She writes 3 notes with the camellia seal. To the librarian, thanking him for the loan of patience. To the physician, acknowledging the theater and promising to continue the role. To the principal wife, observing that camellias listen better when cut at an angle that honors their thorns. The seal leaves a flower that will not wilt. She files a 4th note where only the ribs can find it. When a silence weighs more than a scold, the house has learned a new word. She lies down, the futon learning her again, and beyond the shoji, the moon rehearses a face it will show to everyone with equal indifference. The night watchman clacks the hour, 2 dry shells striking, and a breeze edits the incense into almost nothing. Sleep comes as a messenger without crest or seal, just a simple breath carrying the order to let go. and she obeys with the obedience that has always been her most elegant rebellion. The next morning does not break. It seeps like ink finding the hairline cracks in old paper, coloring them before anyone notices, and she wakes to a light that feels cautious, as though it too has been summoned for questioning. Her maid kneels by the brazier, coax and fire from its gray sleep, the kindling sighing like someone about to speak and deciding against it. She receives the warmed cloth, presses it to her eyes until the night behind them dissolves, and the shape of the room returns, walls breathing in unison with the faint draft that comes from the garden. Outside, the air is as thin as porcelain, crows already announcing verdicts no one asked for, the sound of the gardener's shears clipping through quiet. Inside, the women's quarters are tuned to an unplayed chord, every glance too measured, every bow a fraction slower, as if rehearsing for a scene in which truth will have to pass unnoticed. She chooses her layers with the tact of someone navigating both weather and politics. White linen to suggest clean beginnings, a soft pine green kimono whose color could be mistaken for shadow, an obi patterned with cranes in flight, but small enough that no one could call it ambition. Hair drawn up and held with a single pin carved from plain wood, the sort of ornament that speaks of not wishing to be an ornament herself. Breakfast is served in bowls that remember being Hans rice, miso, 2 slices of pickled radish pale enough to almost be snow. She eats as if each mouthful is an answer being weighed, letting the salt of the miso linger while her mind replays the steward's seal resting on the low table yesterday, the way it seemed heavier than the hand that placed it. Today's schedule is a weaving of errands and appearances, and the principal wife will receive her for incense choosing before midday. The calligraphy master has requested her presence in the late morning, claiming her brushwork might bring fortune to the plum blossom viewing later this week. There is also the shrine, where one does not refuse the gods, even on days when their company feels like scrutiny. The calligraphy room smells faintly of last night's rain, though no window is open. The master places in front of her a fresh sheet of washi and asks for the character river, first as water in motion, then as a boundary, then as memory. The first flows too quickly, the second stalls, the third trembles, and then steadies, as her wrist finds the patience to let ink sink where it chooses. The master nods without praise and turns away, leaving her to wash the brush in silence, broken only by the soft drum of water in the basin. On the way to the shrine, she passes through the north corridor and catches a scene half hidden by a folding screen. 2 kitchen attendants, kneeling low, speaking without moving their lips, one hand resting on a lacquer tray, the other on a folded cloth. Their eyes flick toward her and away like minnows startled under a pier. She carries on without altering her step, because acknowledgement is the quickest way to make yourself part of a story you didn't choose. The shrine's water is colder than yesterday, its surface broken only by the reflection of bare branches. She cups it over her wrists, feeling the bones wake. The priestess offers a sprig of evergreen tied with a red thread and murmurs that this week will require stillness, not strength. She bows, leaving the offering of a single camellia petal, which spins once before resting against the stone basin. When the principal wife summons her, the room is heavy with the scent of sandalwood, 3 censers placed, so that smoke climbs in deliberate spirals. The wife speaks of the upcoming blossom viewing, her voice balancing warmth with the cool geometry of strategy. Who will be invited? Which pavilion will be used? Whether the Lord prefers the view toward the eastern pond or the grove. Her own hands move through a small tray of incense cones, selecting one shaped like a chrysanthemum and another like a folded crane. Scents are like rumors, she says. They last longest when they are not pushed. The concubine nods, committing the phrasing to memory. Because, in this house, even metaphors are currency. As noon approaches, the garden changes voice bees in the plum blossoms. A gardener shaking the moss from a stone lantern. The rustle of silk from women crossing the veranda. In the embroidery room, she takes her place among them, her hands guiding the needle through a piece depicting cranes over water. the thread glinting in a way that could be read as either joy or warning. One of the younger women leans close under the pretense of adjusting her own frame and whispers that the servant involved in the accident will be sent to the western storehouses indefinitely, a posting known for its damp and its distance from influence. Afternoon's task is reading with the librarian, who produces a scroll of travel poetry written by a courtier long dead, verses that turn mountains into thoughts and rivers into excuses. As she copies a stanza about a bridge swallowed by fog, she realizes the poet never named the place, perhaps to keep it safe, perhaps to keep it his. The steward arrives midway, his presence like a shift in temperature, and without looking directly at her, asks whether she might be free in the evening for a small council regarding the blossom viewing. She agrees, noting the absence of any mention of the principal wife in his phrasing. By sunset, the house glows like a paper lantern light trapped inside thin walls, shadows painting themselves into corners. She changes into an evening kimono, the color of quiet rain, hair left looser than etiquette demands, the wooden pin replaced with one of black lacquer, a choice that says she will listen more than she will speak, and the council is held in a side room lit by a single oil lamp, its flame so small it seems to require the attention of everyone present. The steward speaks of seating arrangements, of who must be placed within earshot of whom, of which paths through the garden are to be cleared of fallen petals to prevent unfortunate slips. His eyes rest on her when mentioning the envoy, but she offers no reaction. Only notes on a folded sheet. Later, back in her quarters, she finds the maid has left a folded square of cloth on the pillow inside, a dried camellia petal and a strip of paper bearing a single brushstroke that could be read as watch or wait, depending on where the ink began. She places it beneath her sleeve without unfolding it again, feeling its small weight against her arm as the night settles. The walls inhaling and exhaling in rhythm with the hidden life of the palace, and she understands that tomorrow will not begin clean, but she will still rise, as if it could. Night inside the palace does not so much fall as it unfolds, layer upon layer, each thinner than the last, until what remains is not darkness, but a fabric that muffles sight and sound in equal measure, and she feels herself stitched into it. Another thread among countless others. The lamps in the corridor burn low, their wicks bent toward sleep, casting shadows that bend and sway as though breathing. The air holds the faint residue of sandalwood from the principal wife's chambers and the sharper trace of cedar from the steward's study. Scents that travel like messengers, carrying news in whispers rather than words. She sits before the small mirror-polished bronze, hair loosened to its full weight. Each stroke of the comb, a quiet tally of thoughts she will not speak aloud. Outside, a night wind moves through the plum blossoms, loosening petals that drift down and tap the veranda with the softest percussion, a sound too deliberate to be accident, too light to be warning. The maid enters without footsteps, bringing the evening tea steamed green, the color of distant hills at first thaw, and places beside it a folded slip of paper, unmarked except for a single thread of red silk tied around it. The concubine waits until the maid is gone before untying the thread and finding inside only an ink mark shaped like a crescent, neither letter nor word, but enough to press against her thoughts like a fingertip on still water, making the surface shiver. She leaves her room under the pretense of offering incense at the night shrine, a custom permitted to those wishing to send prayers ahead of important days. In the corridor there passes the moon viewing platform. Where she pauses, the moon tonight is a thin arc, a blade in the dark, and the clouds seem to drift toward it as though summoned. Footsteps sound below in the garden, two voices low enough to be mistaken for wind, until one word envoy reaches her with the clarity of a bell. She moves on before the voices change register, because staying would turn overhearing into listening, and listening has its price. The night shrine is attended only by a single acolyte, his head bowed, the incense embers glowing like a constellation collapsed into a single bowl. She offers her own cone of incense, its smoke rising straight for a moment before curling toward her, carrying a scent she cannot name. Something between pine and rain on stone. The acolyte whispers a blessing that speaks of smooth waters and clear skies, but his eyes flick toward the main hall as though the weather he means is not the weather of the earth. Returning by the garden path, she notices the stone lantern near the koi pond has been turned slightly, its light now aimed at a different stretch of path, small enough that only someone who walks it nightly would notice. In the palace, such adjustments are never merely aesthetic. In her quarters, the tea has cooled, a faint skin forming on its surface like a second thought. She drinks it anyway, tasting the bitterness beneath the leaves, and begins to write in her small, hidden book, not a diary, for that would assume sentiment, but a ledger of moments. The crescent mark, the red thread, the turned lantern, the word envoy in the dark. She writes without dates, only ordering them by the pull they exert on her mind. A distant sound breaks the quiet, a plucked string from somewhere in the entertainment wing, followed by a single note held long enough to tremble into nothing. She wonders if it was practice or signal, remembering that in some circles the number of notes could mean the difference between a greeting and a warning. Hours pass, marked only by the soft collapse of the brazier's embers, until a tap at the shoji panel brings her fully alert. The maid kneels outside, speaking low, saying that tomorrow's morning meal will be served in the Western Hall due to repairs in the main dining chamber. This has never happened in her years here, and she knows the Western Hall is closer to the garden gate, where certain arrivals and departures go unnoticed. When the maid leaves, she stands at the veranda and breathes the night in deeply, feeling the way the air seems to hold its breath with her. A koi breaks the surface of the pond, ripples moving outward until they touch the reflection of the moon and fracture it into silver shards, and she understands this will be the image she carries into sleep. Lying on her side, she listens to the quiet, waiting for it to settle fully, but it never does. The palace tonight hums beneath the silence, a low vibration like the stretched skin of a drum waiting for the first strike. And though her eyes close, the ledger of moments stays open in her mind, each entry a step in a path she cannot yet see, but which she knows she is already walking, whether she wishes to or not. Morning in the palace begins not with the sun, but with the sound of water, the steady, measured pour from bamboo spouts into stone basins, the faint splash of attendants rinsing fresh vegetables for the kitchens, the muted sweep of brooms along the veranda boards. The concubine wakes to these sounds before she opens her eyes, the rhythm of them part of the architecture of her life here. Light filters through the shoji in pale gold, casting the patterns of the wooden lattice across her futon like the shadows of distant bars. She sits slowly, her body as still as her thoughts are restless, and recalls the ledger of moments from last night: the crescent mark, the red thread, the turned lantern, the word envoy, the shift of tomorrow's meal to the Western Hall, which now is today. Her maid enters with the first tray of the day: warm rice, pickled plums, a small dish of simmered greens. Beside it, a single chrysanthemum in a lacquer vase, its petals white as snow, its center still tight and unopened. Flowers are never simply flowers here, they are either message or mirror, and she wonders which this is. As she eats, she hears the sound of sandals on the veranda outside, heavier than a maid's step, lighter than a guard, someone passing deliberately slowly, a pace meant to be noticed without demanding response. She keeps her gaze on her tea, letting the moment pass. Soon she joins the stream of women moving toward the Western Hall, their robes a moving tapestry of silks in muted morning colors, soft blues, warm creams, pale grays, each shade chosen not only for beauty, but for what it says without saying. The hall itself smells faintly of cedar oil and freshly polished floors, its sliding doors thrown open to the garden beyond, where the koi ripple the water under the first rays of sun. She takes her seat along the low table. The arrangement different here, no fixed hierarchy, as in the main hall. Seating decided subtly by who arrives first, who hesitates, who seems distracted. The Lord is not present yet, but his absence feels placed like a stone in the path that makes you walk around and notice the detour. Conversation flows lightly over the meal praise for the autumn chrysanthemums in the inner court. Remarks on the sweetness of the rice, speculation on whether the carp in the pond have been fed, yet all harmless on the surface. Yet beneath it she hears the same undercurrent as last night. Questions about timing, about arrivals, about who has been seen speaking with whom. A cup is refilled for her by a younger concubine she barely knows, the girl's hands trembling slightly as she bows nerves, or message, or both, midway through the meal. The steward enters quietly, carrying a scroll tied with green cord. He kneels before the principal wife, presents it, then steps back without a word. The wife unties it slowly, scans the contents with a face as unreadable as lacquer, then rolls it again and hands it to her attendant, who leaves by the garden gate unusual, as such documents typically leave through 3E main corridor. The concubine notes every movement, every exchange of glance, every adjustment of posture around the table. When the meal ends, the women drift away in small groups, their conversations resuming in low, even tones. She remains a moment longer, watching the light shift across the garden, the shadows of the maple leaves trembling on the gravel as though stirred by more than the wind. In this place, change rarely announces itself. With noise, it moves like water underground, unseen, until it shapes the land above. Walking back toward her chambers, she passes the same stone lantern she noticed turned last night. Now it is facing yet another direction, its light no longer touching the path at all, but cast toward the base of the garden wall, where moss grows thick. She slows, pretending to admire the pond, and catches in her peripheral vision a figure standing just beyond the wall, tall, still, wearing the wide hat of a traveler. By the time she turns her head, the space is empty. Back in her chambers, the chrysanthemum has opened slightly, one layer of petals loosening toward the light. As though marking the passage of time, she places it beside the ledger and writes today's first entry, her brush steady but her breath slow. The flower opens. The day unfolds under a thin veil of haze, the sun's warmth muted as if the sky itself were listening. In the palace gardens, the chrysanthemums glisten faintly with dew. Though the air holds no trace of rain, the concubine moves through the corridors at a deliberate pace, her steps quiet but never hurried, pausing here and there as if to admire a painted screen or the arrangement of pebbles in a courtyard, though her attention is elsewhere on the shifting patterns of movement among the attendants, on which doors are open and which remain closed. In the calligraphy hall, she takes her place at the low desk, the scent of fresh ink sharp in the still air. The practice sheets are laid out in a neat stack, the brush bristles damp and perfectly pointed, the water in the inkstone reflecting a narrow strip of the ceiling beam. Today's exercise is a classical poem about autumn mist and distant cranes, the characters flowing under her hand with the smooth discipline of years. Yet her thoughts run alongside the lines like a shadow, noting the hushed tones of two women near the far window. Their voices are careful, their posture formal, but the rhythm of their pauses is off, the way people speak when they are saying one thing but thinking another. From outside, a sudden clang sharp, metallic breaks the measured quiet. It comes from the western gate, too far for her to see, but close enough to send a ripple through the room. The instructor, an elderly scribe with eyes like dark glass, clears his throat softly, and the sound stills the whispers. The concubine dips her brush in ink again, the black pooling on the tip before she draws the next stroke. When the lesson ends, she leaves the hall and chooses a less traveled path back toward her chambers, one that skirts the outer wall. There, near the base of the wall, she finds faint impressions in the gravel too deep for a bird, too narrow for a guard's boot, the pattern unfamiliar. They trail toward a side gate seldom used, where the latch is set slightly askew, as though closed in haste. She kneels, brushing her fingers lightly over the prints, the fine grit catching under her nails. The sound of a footstep makes her rise smoothly, turning to find one of the kitchen women carrying a basket of radishes, her eyes darting to the gate before dropping to the ground. Back inside, the concubine stops by the textile room under the pretext of examining new silk bolts. The steward's wife is there, supervising, her hands moving over the fabric with practiced ease. In the corner, a chest sits half open, the layers of cloth inside shifting just enough to reveal something that does not belong: parchment, folded and sealed with wax the color of old blood. Before she can look closer, the lid is shut, the key turned with a quiet finality. She returns to her chambers to find the chrysanthemum fully open now, its center revealed, golden and intricate. Beside it, on the lacquered table, lies a slip of paper she did not leave there. It holds a single brushstroke, not a word, but a curved line, like the crescent mark she saw the night before last. She slips it inside the ledger without reading it again, aware that in this place, meaning is rarely given freely. It is something you assemble piece by careful piece, until the whole picture stands before you, and by then it may already be too late to change it. Outside, the haze thickens, blurring the garden into something that feels neither entirely present nor entirely distant, as though the palace itself is holding its breath. By the time the afternoon deepens, the air has thickened into a muted gold, the haze outside filtering the light into something both soft and unreal. The concubine sits by the op, in shoji, the garden before her a watercolor of shifting shadows and blurred edges. The faint drip of water from a bamboo pipe marks time in intervals too slow to measure by thought alone. She is embroidering threads sliding through silk, each stitch a gesture of discipline and quiet control, yet her attention is caught by the way the sparrows and the farm maples scatter all at once, as if brushed by an unseen hand. Moments later, a figure passes along the outer path beyond the garden wall, the wide hat dipping low. The step measured, and even the same silhouette she glimpsed that morning, though again it vanishes before she can rise. She sets her work aside, crossing to the small alcove, where the chrysanthemum now seems almost too large for its vase, petals heavy with the weight of full bloom. She traces one with the tip of her finger, the softness deceptive, the stem beneath firm and unyielding. A faint knock at the door, 3 taps, the pause deliberate brings her maid, who kneels and delivers a folded piece of silk. Inside, wrapped with the care of something valuable, is a small ivory comb, carved with cranes in flight. The craftsmanship is fine, but she knows the gift is not for beauty, it is for meaning. And cranes, here, speak of journeys, departures, sometimes exile. She places it on the table beside the ledger, its presence a quiet weight. In the corridor beyond, she hears the shuffle of steps, the low murmur of 2 guards speaking in dialect, not native to the palace, their words clipped, ending abruptly when another set of footsteps approaches. Silence falls, then the sound of sandals moving away toward the main hall. As dusk begins its slow descent, the western bell tolls once, deep and resonant, a sound usually reserved for the arrival of envoys or the announcement of formal audiences. Within moments, attendants pass briskly in the courtyards, their arms full of fresh scrolls, cushions, trays of tea, the pace quick, but their faces blank, eyes lowered. From her veranda, the concubine watches the western gate open, just enough to allow a single figure through, cloaked, hooded, posture erect, moving without hesitation toward the inner compound. No formal herald, no procession, only the quiet, deliberate entrance of someone who does not require permission. She steps back into the shadows, knowing that to be seen watching is to invite notice. And in this place, notice is a currency far more dangerous than gold. Inside, the comb catches the fading light, the carved cranes seeming to move in the shifting glow, wings lifting as if ready to leave. The air in the chamber feels denser now, the scent of the chrysanthemum sharper, almost metallic. She closes the shoji, letting the garden fall away into memory, and sits before the ledger. The brush in her hand hesitates above the page, then writes slowly. The gates open without fanfare. She pauses, listens not for the obvious sounds, but for the absence of them, the missing laughter from the servants' quarters, the halted music from the eastern wing, the way even the koi pond outside seems still. And in that absence, she feels the shape of the evening forming, its edges as precise and unforgiving as a blade. Night in the palace does not fall abruptly, it seeps in, like ink spreading across paper, each corridor and courtyard darkening by degrees until the boundaries between shadow and substance dissolve. Lanterns are lit along the main walkways, their glow warm but too faint to push back the deeper dark that pools in the alcoves and beneath the eaves. The concubine leaves her chamber under the pretext of delivering a message to the seamstress, her maid trailing at a respectful distance. The air is cooler now, scented faintly with pine smoke from the kitchens, and every sound the click of sandals on wood, the whisper of a sliding door feels amplified in the stillness. As she passes the western veranda, she notices two guards posted where earlier there had been none, their armor lacquered and dark, their stances rigid. Neither speaks, but one's gaze follows her, until she is past. In the seamstress's room, a single lamp burns low, throwing long shadows across bolts of fabric. The seamstress herself is bent over a robe, the needle catching glints of light as it moves. When she looks up, there is no greeting, only a small, almost imperceptible shake of the head, warning enough. The concubine leaves without delivering the message, retracing her steps along a different route that takes her through the covered walkway by the koi pond. Here, the water reflects the lantern light in ripples, but the fish are still clustered near the bottom as if avoiding the surface. Halfway across, she hears it, a soft, rhythmic scrape, like something dragged slowly over wood. She stops, listening, and it comes again from beneath the walkway. Bending slightly, she catches a flicker of movement in the darkness under the boards, the glint of metal, the faint scent of oil. Before she can linger, the sound of sandals approaches from the far end, and she straightens, moving on with steady steps. Near her own chambers, she finds the shoji slightly open. Inside, the lantern is out, the room faintly lit only by the pale spill of moonlight. The chrysanthemum is gone from its vase, the table bare save for the ivory comb, which now rests at the exact center of the lacquered surface, its position too deliberate to be chance. Beside it lies another slip of paper, this one bearing two brushstrokes intersecting at an angle an unfamiliar mark. She does not touch it, instead closing the shoji softly and standing in the dark until her eyes adjust. Outside, somewhere in the southern wing, a lute begins to play. The melody slow, almost mournful, each note hanging in the air before fading into silence. It is not the hour for music, and the choice of tune is not one played for pleasure. It is a call, a signal, understood only by those meant to hear it. She moves to the veranda, scanning the garden. Nothing stirs, but the shadows between the lanterns feel heavier, as if they conceal more than absence. She returns to the table, sits, and turns the comb in her hands, the carved cranes seeming now to fly in the opposite direction from before. In the quiet, she senses the balance shifting, the unseen weight in the air, pressing just enough to tell her that whatever is moving toward her has already crossed the threshold. The moon climbs higher, its light now silvering the rooftops and catching in the curves of the tiled eaves. The palace feels both vast and enclosed, as if every corridor were a vein in some great sleeping creature. The concubine remains seated at the low table, the ivory comb before her, its smooth surface cool to the touch, the carved cranes frozen mid-flight. She lets her fingers rest there, not in comfort but in measure, as if weighing the space between each breath. From somewhere beyond her walls comes the faint sound of water splashing, not the steady trickle of the garden's bamboo fountain, but the abrupt and even sound of something heavy dropped into a shallow pool. She rises, sliding the shoji open just enough to look out. But the garden remains empty, the lantern swaying gently in a breeze she cannot feel. Closing the door, she moves to the far alcove, where a narrow window looks toward the inner courtyard. Here, the light from the moon is clearer, unhindered by paper screens, and it falls across the stones in a pale wash. Two figures cross the courtyard, moving quickly but without urgency, their robes unmarked by the insignia of palace rank, their heads turned slightly as if listening. They vanish beneath the overhang of the eastern wing, and in their absence the courtyard seems flatter, the air thinner. A moment later, a shadow slides across the stones from the opposite side alone, deliberate, its owner hidden from view. She pulls back, aware that even a silhouette could betray her. The quiet in the chamber thickens, broken only by the faint rasp of cloth against wood, as her maid kneels just inside the door, bowing low before placing a covered tray on the floor. The gesture is precise, almost ritualistic, but when the maid lifts the cover to reveal the evening tea, the steam carries not the familiar scent of jasmine, but something sharper, tinged with bitterness. As the concubine does not drink, merely inclines her head in thanks, watching the maid retreat without once meeting her gaze. After she's gone, the concubine moves to the veranda again, the night air cooler now, touched by the scent of rain, though the sky remains clear. In the distance, a bell chimes not the deep, measured tone of ceremony, but a higher pitch, struck twice, then once, the pattern unfamiliar. She knows enough of palace signals to recognize it as neither call nor warning. It is personal, meant for ears already attuned to its meaning. Beyond the wall, the faint creak of a gate, followed by the soft thud of footsteps on packed earth, draws her eyes to the narrow passage near the storehouse. A shape lingers there briefly before melting into the dark. Returning inside, she finds the slip of paper beside the comb turned over, revealing on its reverse a single red dot, centered and perfectly round, the ink still fresh. It is not a signature, nor a seal. Its meaning is in its placement, its simplicity. She places it back exactly as she found it, sits once more, and waits, knowing that the true shape of the night will arrive not in the noise of movement, but in the moment when all sound stops. The stillness holds for so long that it begins to feel permanent, as if the palace itself has forgotten movement. Yet when it breaks, it does so without warning. The first sound is a muffled thud, distant but heavy enough to vibrate through the floorboards beneath her knees. Then comes the faint, metallic rattle of something dropped or deliberately placed upon stone. She rises instantly, sliding the shoji aside just a fraction, the cool night air rushing in. The garden remains as before, lanterns glowing softly, koi pond reflecting the moon. But her eyes catch the slightest disturbance ripples on the water where moments ago it lay still. She steps out onto the veranda, bare feet silent against the wood. The ripples widen, spreading outward from a point near the far edge, and there, half in shadow, she sees it. A small silk pouch, pale against the dark water, drifting toward the center before sinking slowly out of sight. No one is near the pond, yet as she turns her gaze toward the covered walkway, she notices a figure at the very end, motionless, facing her, the features obscured by distance and shadow. Before she can call out, the figure tilts its head slightly, then vanishes behind the support beam with a fluid, unhurried step. She moves toward the pond, intent on retrieving the pouch, but as she kneels at the edge, her hand hovering just above the surface, the water shifts again, this time from below, as if something brushed against it from the depths. She withdraws her hand slowly, retreating a step before standing fully. From behind her, the faintest sound, a single footstep on wood. She turns, but the veranda is empty. The shoji to her chamber closed exactly as she left it. The sensation of being watched presses against her back as she crosses the threshold, sliding the door shut and kneeling once more at the table. The comb remains where it was, but the slip of paper is gone. In its place lies a thin strip of black silk, frayed at one end, its texture coarse against her fingertips. Outside, the music begins again, no longer the soft, mournful pluck of a lute, but the sharper, more deliberate tones of a shamisen, the melody structured like a conversation in which only one voice is heard. Between phrases, she hears other sounds layered beneath it, whispers, low and urgent, though no words can be distinguished. She moves to the narrow window in the alcove, the moonlight now brighter, throwing the courtyard into sharper relief. In the far corner, where the shadows pool deepest, 3 figures stand close together, their heads bent. One gestures toward her wing, the movement sharp, decisive. A moment later, they separate, 2 disappearing into the eastern passage, the third lingering long enough to glance up toward her window. When she steps back, the chamber feels smaller, the air denser. She places the black silk beside the comb, aligning them precisely, then extinguishes the lantern, letting the darkness settle fully. If the night has chosen to come for her, it will find her ready, seated in silence, her eyes fixed on the point where the door's edge meets the frame, waiting for the slightest shift that will mark the exact moment the unseen becomes seen. The hour before dawn is the most fragile, when the world holds its breath between the weight of night and the promise of day. In the concubine's chamber, the air has cooled, carrying with it the faint scent of damp stone and the distant trace of pine from the outer gardens. She remains seated, the black silk and ivory comb before her like relics from a half-remembered dream, their presence too deliberate to dismiss, yet too cryptic to interpret. The silence now is not emptiness, but watchfulness. And though her eyes are fixed on the line of the door, her ears pull in the faintest threads of sound, the quiet padding of feet far down the corridor, the subtle shift of roof tiles as something moves above, the sigh of wind caught between the palace walls. She rises at last, stepping onto the veranda, where the garden lies silvered in the thinning moonlight. The pond is calm again, its surface unbroken. Yet on the far bank, she sees a faint trail of moisture, as though something or someone has climbed out not long ago. The path leads toward the north gate, vanishing into the darker mass of cypress and stone. From the east, the first light of dawn begins to bleed into the sky, a pale wash that turns the edges of the clouds to thin gold. With it comes a sound, the slow, rhythmic beat of a drum, too measured for alarm, too solemn for celebration. It is the sound of procession, the kind used to mark formal movement within the palace. Yet no ceremony has been announced for this day. She follows the sound, moving along the covered walkway until the drumbeat grows clearer, each strike followed by the soft jangle of metal rings. Turning the corner, she stops just short of the open courtyard. There, in the half-light, a small group advances, 4 men in dark robes, their heads bowed, each carrying a narrow lacquered box bound in red cord. Behind them walks a single figure in pale garments, face hidden beneath a broad-brimmed hat. They move without speaking, their steps in perfect unison, the boxes held level as if their contents could not be disturbed. She watches as they cross the courtyard and vanish into the west wing, the drumbeat ceasing the moment they pass beneath its arch. When the silence returns, it feels heavier, as though it has been waiting for her alone. Retreating to her chamber, she finds the tray from earlier now empty, the cup overturned, a faint ring of moisture marking the place where it stood. Beside it lies another strip of silk, this one white, folded neatly, and beneath it a pressed camellia blossom, its petals intact but darkened at the edges. The flower's scent lingers faintly in the air, mingling with the sharper note of whatever had been in the tea. She kneels, placing the new silk beside the black, their contrast stark against the table's surface. The meaning remains elusive, yet the pattern grows, and with it a certainty whatever has begun will not end with the night, nor with the morning, but will follow her into the hours ahead, shaping each step, each glance, each word she dares to speak. Dawn does not arrive so much as confess itself. a slow untying of color at the rim of the sky, and in that loosening she hears the palace choose its mask for the day. The maid enters with water and bows deeper than usual, as if distance could be a form of protection, placing the basin so gently that the surface does not ripple. Steen carries a hint of yuzu peel and the ghost of sandalwood, a careful kindness to remind the skin that it still belongs to morning. She washes, dries, and lets the bronze mirror find her again, not to judge, but to inventory eyes steady, breath obedient, the line of the mouth composed into the dialect of patience. The two strips of silk lie where she left them black, white now joined by the pressed camellia. She slides them into the hollow of a book of poems, between verses that turn rivers into sentences and mountains into commas, a hiding place that is not hiding so much as postponement. Breakfast is a ceremony of restraint, rice precise as snow, miso that remembers salt water, a sliver of daikon bright as a bell, and she eats with the deliberate smallness that keeps a day from believing it can take more than she offers. The drum from before dawn has gone quiet, but its echo has remained behind the walls like a stain. When she steps onto the veranda, the air is glass cool, the garden made of breath and light, and on the far gravel a single line has been traced with the tip of a stick, a curve opening into itself like a crescent moon that refuses to close. She follows the corridor toward the west wing, where the lacquered boxes disappeared, and before she reaches the turning, she meets the librarian, arms full of sighing paper. He bows and asks, without asking, if she will walk the long way by the moon platform, because some paths are safer when they are scenic. She agrees, and they pace their steps to the rhythm of not knowing. Near the platform, the stone lantern that turned twice has been returned to its original posture, but a second lantern answers it now, angled half a palm's width toward the cypress. Lanterns do not hold opinions here, people do. The librarian leaves her with a note no ink has touched. The book you want returns itself if you pretend you never borrowed it, and his eyes, which always carry the weather, are cloudy. At the moon platform, a figure is waiting, not seated, not standing, but leaning against the rail as if listening for a tide that cannot reach this far inland. The hat is wide-brimmed rice straw, the robe an ordinary brown that has learned how to be overlooked. When she approaches, the figure does not move, only lets the silence greet her first. Then a gloved hand lifts, palm empty, and the voice that follows is low, careful, trained to be unremarkable. You have been listening to the house. She bows at the angle given to truths that are not compliments. The voice continues, not quite a question. Then you know that doors speak before they open. A pause, a breath. The figure sets a small bamboo tube on the rail between them, bound with red thread no thicker than a vein, and steps back. Sometimes silk is only silk, the voice says, until someone pretends to sleep. She does not touch the tube yet. Instead, she lets the wind inspect it first. What do you ask? She says, which is the only safe shape for curiosity to wear. To be seen as arriving by accident, the voice replies, and to be remembered as a delay. The hat tilts as if to listen for someone else approaching. Nothing comes. The figure adds, softly enough to be mistaken for advice to the air. If the camellia darkens at the edges, do not boil the water. Let it cool and speak to you. Then the weight of presence loosens, and with two steps that do not belong to any servant she knows, the figure is gone, dissolving into the color of corridors absence dressed as furniture. Alone, she takes the tube and does not open it until her room has been restored to the performance of normal. Shoji half-drawn, tray removed, and hair smoothed. Sleeves aligned with quiet so that the room would pass any inspection by sound. The thread yields under the patience of a thumbnail. Inside, three things nesting like remarks in a parable. A sliver of lacquer shaved from a tray, warped barely enough to wobble when pressed to the table. A tiny iron ring, blackened, the sort that belongs to a chain for fixing a gate. and a scrap of paper with a single character written in the gold-flecked ink her master gave her. A stop that is also a stay, a halt that can mean enough or here, depending on where the feet point. She closes her hand around them and learns their weights: splinter, circle, word, each a different kind of door. The morning unfurls obligations like Fan's calligraphy with the old master, who asks for weight in four tempers: as river, as dog at threshold, as bow that has not yet been strung, as eyelid between blink and look. She writes until the brush feels more like pulse than tool. He nods at the third and looks away from the fourth as if it had revealed too much. Then, incense with the principal wife, who has chosen a blend that behaves like snow on cedar present, hushed, inevitable. They speak of blossom viewing roots and roof repairs and the way clouds prefer the eastern pond afternoon. The wife's smile is a screen painted with cranes that do not fly. She slides across the lacquered surface a hair ornament of worked silver cranes mid-flight and says nothing. The ornament is the twin of the message left yesterday, and twins in this house mean more than family. The concubine bows, accepts, does not wear it. At the western hall, the steward appears, deposited by the air the way a leaf is delivered to a corner. His left foot is straight today, decision, not doubt. He invites, without inviting, her presence at a reading for two guests from the north, whose ears prefer tales that end neatly. On the way, he arranges the corridor into a conversation. Storerooms do not like to be opened after moonrise, he offers. Some moons prefer attics, she replies. Boxes that travel without heralds grow heavy, he says. Heavy things teach floors to remember, she answers. His eyes approve of the grammar and move on. The guests receive a story about a magistrate who judged a case by listening to a well at midnight. She reads, with the voice that makes people think the paper is telling itself. They thank the steward for his excellent choice. Not one of them notices that the well in the story was lined with camellias. Afternoon leans, and the haze returns, a muffled gold that makes edges politely withdraw. At the embroidery, quarter needles blink like small lighthouses. Gossip quilts itself without visible hands. The servant from the western accident is seen near the storehouses again, but no longer carries a tray. The envoy's man with the hat like a traveling road has visited the cypress gate twice without entering. A lute string snapped at noon, and the musician laughed too quickly. She stores these swallows under the roof of her ribs. When the bell offers its thin three-note pattern the private music of messages, she is already on the covered walk by the koi pond, where the bamboo dipper repeats its lesson about patience. And the same figure waits at the far post, as unremarkable as a noun. Nearer this time, so near she can read the ink on the glove's seam. A box arrived before dawn. The voice says, the words assembled as if not to disturb the boards. 4 boxes, she answers. Red cord, a drum that knew its steps. The figure accepts the tally. A 5th box left before anyone admits it existed. It took the wrong gate and the right shadow. Do you see where the lantern points now? She remembers the lantern's correction. The second turned a palm-width light, thrown not on the path but on the foot of the wall. You want me to look at moss, she says. I want you to walk where feet are not supposed to have names. The voice corrects gently. And if I do? Then perhaps you will not need to open the comb. Some doors are only doors if you knock. The figure tilts its head, listening to a footstep that hasn't happened yet. When? She asks. When the koi gather in the bright water without eating, comes the answer, which is less a time than a weather. The gloved hand sets down something softer than a promise, and stronger than an instruction. A strip of gray silk, narrow, frayed, the color of mist when it decides to be rowed. Then the figure is gone again. Proof that departures can be a kind of grammar. In her chamber, she lays the 3 silks together, black, white, gray, like a palette that has decided to paint fog. The bamboo tube's relics rest beside them. She writes in the ledger, 5 without 5, Lantern Dick, Tate's Moss. Gray is the hour. The chrysanthemum in the alcove has begun to brown along two petals, darkening at the edges, just as the voice predicted. She does not boil water. She speaks to it instead, aloud but softly, the way one reads to someone awake with their eyes closed. The room answers by doing nothing, which is the best kind of reply. Evening arrives with the sound of sandals corrected to quiet, lanterns catching flame as if taught by memory. The steward's reading was an anteroom to a smaller anteroom, a council with 3 names and 6 shadows. The principal wife does not attend, which is attendance of another sort. The talk is pedals and seating and weather on its knees. Until it isn't, the envoy prefers the western gate, says a minor official, voice casual as lint. Gates prefer what they are paid to prefer, answers the steward, wiping an invisible error from the table. No one laughs. She observes the game's new piece placed without clatter. The koi fulfill the prophecy before the stars learn their lines, gathering in a sudden, shimmering congregation beneath the lantern that throws its light across the shallow shelf glitter without hunger. She wraps the gray silk around her wrist like a reason and walks the garden as if reciting a poem they forgot to write. At the mossed foot of the wall, where the lantern's revised gaze kneels, her fingers find what the light has been teaching: 2 depressions that are not stones, a wedge where lacquer once rested, and in the seam a thin paper scale, slick as the skin of a fish, a receipt's corner, stamped with a mark she has only seen on crates of oil for hinges. She leaves it where it is, memorizes the tear of its edge, the angle of the stamp, the grit clinging to its underside. This is not collection. This is listening with the hands. The first open contact finds its second shape when she turns from the wall and meets the figure at human distance. The hat's brim now a horizon she could reach with her palm, the voice says. We do not seek your loyalty, we seek your accuracy, which is both instruction and absolution. She answers, accuracy is a loyalty that does not brag, and the figure's silence agrees. A second bamboo tube appears, lighter than the first. For after, says the voice, which is a dangerous tense. After what? She asks. After the kind of rain that falls inside, and the lantern hums because wood knows more than words. She does not open the tube. She ties its thread tighter. When she returns to her chamber, the maid has left the lamp unlit by design. Darkness this soft is a courtesy. She sits and lets the room find its borders around her again. The comb waits, cranes on the cusp of choosing a direction. She does not turn it. The strips of silk lie like 3 versions of a sentence. She does not read them. The pressed camellia has grown darker by the width of a breath. She does not move it. Action now would be the loudest thing in the room. Instead, she writes a single character on a square of washi with the gold-flecked ink. Mungate and places it face down beneath the comb, because some talismans do not need to be seen to work. Before sleep can be negotiated, the palace tries one last time to talk her out of it. A chord struck once in the far music room, a guard's spear butt kissing stone, a bird waking wrong and correcting itself, 3 drips in the courtyard basin that do not belong to any bamboo rhythm. She lets them all pass through her like a parade she refuses to watch. The ledger receives one more line. To be seen as accident, to be remembered as delay, and underneath it, smaller. After. Then she folds herself into the exact shape of breath that dreams do not trip over. And the house, satisfied that she has chosen the same mask it wears, allows the hour to close like a fan that remembers every opening it ever made. The morning sun climbs higher, but its light does not bring warmth to the concubine's chamber. The air is still, heavy with the weight of unspoken things, and the shadows cling to the corners as if reluctant to retreat. The white strip of silk and the camellia lie beside the black ribbon from the night before. Their quiet presence, a message she cannot yet read, but feels in her bones is meant only for her. She does not touch them now, instead turning her attention to the faint sound drifting from the far courtyard, the same slow drumbeat she heard before dawn, but this time accompanied by the low hum of voices, too distant to decipher. She slides open the shoji and steps onto the veranda. The boards cool under her bare feet, the scent of pine sharper now in the sunlit air. From her vantage point, she sees movement, two attendants crossing the garden, each carrying a narrow bamboo case bound with red cord, identical to the ones borne by the procession in the early light. They do not speak to one another, their eyes fixed ahead, their pace deliberate. She watches them vanish into the east wing, the direction reserved for private counsel and matters the public eye is never meant to see. Something in her stirs a pull between fear and curiosity, and she knows that to remain passive is to remain ignorant, a luxury she can no longer afford. She dresses simply, choosing a muted robe that will not draw notice, and moves through the corridors with the unhurried grace expected of her station. Her gaze lowered but her ears alert to every fragment of conversation, every step that falters when she passes. In the east wing, the air is cooler, the light dimmer. The shoji here covered in heavier paper that filters the sun to a muted glow. She slows her pace as voices grow clearer, men speaking in clipped tones. The scrape of wood as something is unsealed. Then, the soft, distinct sound of paper unfurling. She stops just short of the open threshold, her eyes finding a narrow gap in the panel through which she can see two figures kneeling beside a low table, the bamboo cases before them now open, their contents laid out in careful rows. Scrolls, folded documents, and at the center, a single object that catches the light, a small, carved ivory token, no larger than a thumb, its surface etched with characters she cannot read from here. One man lifts it reverently, holding it between his palms as if in offering, while the other makes a mark on the scroll beside him. They speak again, the words muffled but the tone unmistakable, measured, deliberate, carrying the weight of consequence. She leans closer, the wood cool beneath her fingertips, when suddenly the man with the token pauses, his head turning slightly as though he has felt the weight of unseen eyes. She steps back into shadow, holding her breath, and a moment later the voices resume, softer now, as if guarded. She retreats, her steps as silent as the shifting dust in the air, and makes her way back through the palace, her mind tracing the lines between the black silk, the white ribbon, the camellia, and now this the token, the scrolls, the cases bound in red. In her chamber once more, she finds the table undisturbed, yet a new element awaits her. A folded slip of paper resting atop the white ribbon. She unfolds it to find a single brushstroke, bold, unbroken, the shape unfamiliar yet heavy with intent. There is no signature, no seal, only that solitary mark, as if it were a key to a door she has not yet found. She places it carefully with the others, her gaze lingering as she feels the balance shift. The game has moved forward, and whether she chooses to play or not, her place within it is already set. Beyond the garden, the drumbeat fades, replaced by the sound of wind through the cypress, carrying with it the faint echo of laughter, not joyous, not mocking, but something in between, a sound that lingers in the air long after it has passed, leaving her with the unshakable sense that the day has only just begun to show its teeth. The day chosen for blossom viewing arrives with a sky that looks washed and hung to dry, thin blue stretched taut across the eaves, a brightness that refuses to shout. The palace puts on its most careful face, and everyone who lives inside it learns again how to move, as if their footsteps were part of a practiced poem. The concubine wakes before the first shadow is sharp enough to measure, the room already rehearsing daylight in the pale square cast by the shoji. Her maid kneels with a basin that gives off a faint steam, a ghost of yuzu and hinoki in the water. She cleanses hands and face, dries with a towel warmed on coals, and looks into the bronze mirror, not to find herself, but to check whether the line of her mouth has remembered patience. On the low table lie the three silks, black, white, gray, the pressed camellia, now the color of old cream, the ivory comb with cranes facing east, as if the horizon were a promise they intend to keep. The bamboo tube waits where she left it, a thin bone of decision. today demands a robe that looks like it has nothing to prove. She chooses a silk the color of slow rain, with reeds faintly stitched along the hem and threads so pale they appear only when she moves. The obi is the tone of ash at the moment before it goes cold, tied modestly lower than perfection, to appease those who prefer the afternoon, to find no reason for a pin. Ion. Hair is smoothed with a breath of camellia oil, and bound with a single lacquer pin dark as a well. Makeup is a whisper, not a word powder to even the moon, a sigh of red to remind the mouth not to forget it is human. Breakfast is deliberate quiet rice that steams like a polite mistake, miso that tastes of harbors and long patience, pickled radish that rings a small bell somewhere behind the teeth. She eats slowly. The maid says nothing until the empty bowl is a fact, then mentions, as if commenting on the weather, that the western walk has been brushed twice, and the stone lanterns along the long pond have been turned to greet the blossoms. Lanterns, she thinks, greeting stone flowers that never bloom, and smiles the kind of smile that disappears before anyone can claim it. Word arrives in the corridor with the sound of sandals softened by fresh cloth on soles. The steward requests the presence of selected women at the East Pavilion. For preliminary incense before the Lord's arrival, the principal wife will preside. The envoy from the north will be near, but not within. Phrases like these are furniture now arranged, dusted, lived around. The concubine bows to the message as if it were a person, and steps into the slow current that carries everyone toward the same hour. The East Pavilion opens like a spare thought onto the garden. The plum and camellia are already past their pride. The early cherries have decided to offer more shadow than bloom. Cushions are set at courteous intervals, and censers release a smoke that practices being a path. The principal wife's posture is a lesson no one writes down. She gestures to cones of incense in a lacquer tray cedar, snow, sea salt, thunder, and asks for counsel with a tone that makes counsel feel like confession. The concubine suggests the cedar first to quiet the room that has not yet admitted it is nervous. The wife nods once, the kind of approval that counts without keeping score. The air changes smoke, taking its own advice, and the pavilion learns how to breathe together. The librarian attends with scrolls he pretends require the day's light. His eyes have weather in them that cannot decide. The old calligraphy master arrives with a brush wrapped as if it were a small animal. The steward floats at the edges, his left foot unturned, which means he arrived already convinced. Attendants pour tea that remembers mountains. Women accept cups with the left hand, steady the saucer with the right, a choreography that looks like water teaching itself manners. Beyond the pavilion, near the curve of the long pond, musicians tune the day, koto strings lifted into question, shamisen finding an agreement with air. A dancer's sleeves speak with more confidence than her eyes. Koi drift to the bright shallows, hungry for nothing. And the stone lantern that altered its opinion twice this week now considers the angle that shows most moss. Accuracy, she hears again in her head, is a loyalty that does not brag. Then the Lord arrives in the manner weather arrives, felt first on the skin, noticed only after the garden has agreed. His robe is not the dark authority of evening, but a gray that has studied clouds. His hairpin writes a fine line of light near his temple. He accepts the incense as if it had asked kindly to be accepted. Greetings are exchanged with bows calibrated to keep anyone from falling. He looks at nothing long enough to have looked at everything. When his gaze slides across the concubine, it does not pause, and because it does not pause, it writes a new sentence in the quiet. Today you will be part of the chorus, not the solo. This is mercy. This is warning. The procession for blossom viewing is smaller than rumor had prepared for. A choice, not an accident. The route follows the southern walk, crosses the moon platform, and pauses at the long pond where a temporary bridge has been placed, 2 planks, 3 supports, a span no longer than a thought. The steward announces that the envoy will be received after the first poem. A minor official recites a verse about petals that do not fall but decide to be air. The principal wife contemplates the bridge like a sentence that may contain a trap but is too well written to refuse. The concubine watches the lanterns' mouths they speak by where they refuse to shed light. Today they refuse the seam where plank meets stone. Movement begins. The Lord steps first, as is law. The wife follows at the distance etiquette requires. The steward measures his duty into strides. Women cross in order of a hierarchy that has learned to keep itself from remembering who invented it. When the concubine's turn arrives, she places her feet as if writing a character that will be read by wood. The planks answer with a note that announces neither crack nor comfort. Across they go, and the garden does not flinch. Tea in the middle pavilion is a quiet argument between summer and restraint. Sweets shaped like blossoms apologize for color in a world that prefers memo. The envoy makes his approach with a retinue that seems smaller by one and absence that behaves itself. He bows with a sincerity that could be performance. His hat is refined humility. His eyes practice not seeing. The steward greets him with a grammar of not letting go. The librarian presents a scroll as if it were a meal. The old master refuses to notice the thread near the envoy's sleeve that does not belong to this house. The principal wife allows silence to translate itself. The Lord lets the translation stand. And in that standing, a breeze moves through the pavilion, not air, but an adjustment. Musicians halt between notes. Koi in the pond below gather under the bridge, as if to become one thought. And in the small distance where shadow meets floor, a single camellia petal, brown at the edge, decides to fall upward in the mind before it lands downward in the world. A servant passes with a tray whose lacquer reveals a shy warp. The concubine's eye follows the reflection along its curve to the seam of the floorboard near the pillar. 3 breaths. Nothing. And then the first interruption of the day takes the shape of courtesy, a messenger kneeling just beyond the threshold, forehead to the mat, delivering a tube with red cord to the steward. Red cord in daylight is not a scream, it is a cough. The steward accepts without changing the vowel he is currently wearing, slides the tube to rest near the inkstone, and continues not to open it until the conversation has pretended to forget the tube exists. When he does open it, he does so with a thumbnail that has learned patience. Inside is not a scroll, but a thin wedge of lacquer shaved from a tray, a black iron ring the size of a thumb, and a receipt corner stamped with oil's mark twins to the parables the concubine keeps hidden in her room. The steward's eyes do not rise. He closes the tube. The tea is sweet. The day is still a day. The first poem is requested. Someone volunteers something about river light on armor. The Lord's mouth says that it is adequate. Then he turns to the concubine without looking like he has turned, and asks, as if he were asking the weather to agree to be weather, for a tanka. She bows, the pavilion inhales. She recites, bridge without shadow, plank remembering 2 names. Koi hold back their mouths, lanterns bow to the mossed wall. Camellia learns to wait. The air changes shape and then decides not to. The envoy smiles the way a bowl smiles when it is empty, and knows it will be filled. Somewhere under the floorboard, a small creature reconsiders hunger. The steward looks not at her but at the principal wife. Because some approvals are triangulated, movement resumes. Because movement is the kingdom's disguise. A path is taken that should have been taken yesterday. A screen is slid to reveal a garden arranged to look like accident. The day, meanwhile, has arranged something else. The second interruption arrives as a laugh from the outer path. Too sharp to be decoration. Guards glance without moving their heads. A lute string snaps and is replaced so quickly the break must have been expected. The dancer stops mid-step and bows, as if she meant to teach stillness. The concubine watches the envoy's left sleeve thread still wrong, color still obedient, and the narrow scar at his wrist that has learned to be shy. Accuracy is a loyalty that does not brag, she repeats inside, and lets her eyes be a ledger without ink. The steward calls for a short procession to the moon platform. The route will pass the long pond again. The lanterns will keep their opinions. The bridge will answer new feet. Women rise. Robes decide their weather, tea becomes memory. When they reach the planks, the koi have gathered beneath like a rumor trying to become law. The lord crosses, the wife crosses, the envoy crosses. The tray with the shy warp does not cross. When the concubine steps onto the first plank and hears, not crack, not groan, but a breath held by wood. In that breath she knows, with the kind of knowing that has no words because words would arrive too late, that after the figure promised has come to the threshold, nothing breaks. Instead, something is found on the stone at the far end of the bridge, beneath the lip where moss thrives. A small ivory token sits as if it grew there, and a seal etching of a character that looks like a gate bearing rain. The steward sees it when he is not looking. The principal wife sees it by choosing to admire moss. The envoy does not see it because his hat knows its work. The concubine sees it because she must. No one touches it. Leaving evidence untouched is also a loyalty. They pass, the token remains, the garden pretends not to have noticed it emigrated from a place that isn't here. After the circuit, the court breaks into polite dispersal. Some women drift like lantern light to the shade of the camphor. Officials become silhouettes in the narrow corridor where decisions are dressed. The principal wife invites the concubine to sit where the wind can be believed. They share a cup that returns heat to the lips. The blossoms insist on being later than expected. The wife says, "Some things insist on arriving before names." The concubine answers. The wife lets the answer sit without furniture. If a comb points east in a room with no window, the wife asks the air, "What does the mirror think?" The concubine does not answer aloud. Mirrors, she has learned, prefer not to be asked. The envoy departs for the inner hall with bowing that has clearly been to school. The steward lingers near the moss step and does not bend. A guard coughs the cough that says he is counting. The librarian adjusts a scroll he did not bring. The calligraphy master asks the koi whether hunger is a language. The koi respond by being beautiful. And now the day performs its quiet turn. A messenger arrives from the north gate, carrying a plain-wrapped parcel for the librarian. Plain parcels never are. The librarian accepts with the composure of someone who will open a door later. The concubine returns to her room by the longest short way, making sure to cross both shadows the lanterns have refused to light. In the corridor, a child of a kitchen woman, old enough to carry water but not old enough to pretend not to notice, stops, bows too deeply, and recites a string of numbers. 2, 1, 2, 3. A game, or yesterday's pattern on the bell, or the count of lanterns turned. She bows back as if blessed and continues, "Inside the chamber the bamboo tube is not where she left it. It stands now at an angle that declares attention." She unties the red thread and slides the cap inside. Folded 3 times until it has taught itself to prefer narrowness, is a map without names. Lines that are not roads but ours. A square that is not a room but a silence. A small circle marked in gold-flecked ink. At the foot of what must be the long pond. Precisely where the token had chosen to exist. Beneath the map, a slip of paper no larger than a fingernail reads simply, "Men," the same character she wrote last night and hid beneath the comb. The room considers her. She sets the map on the lacquer and anchors its corners with the 3 strips of silk white in the east, black in the west, gray in the place where corridors change their minds. Then she sits and does the one act a palace never rehearses. Nothing, no movement, no sound, just the patience that makes a gate prefer to open toward you. Outside, Blossom Viewing performs its gentler scenes poems exchanged like folded weather, laughter with its sharp edges filed down, footsteps soft with the authority of grass. The steward holds the day together by refusing to pull any of its threads. The principal wife renames a breeze into omen and then into nothing. The envoy practices his exit at the far veranda. The librarian pockets a parcel and pretends his sleeve did it. The old master draws the character for listen on air with his forefinger and no ink, and the air keeps it. The sun moves 1 width of a hair. a cloud decides to behave. A lantern learns a new angle. And at the exact moment when the koi rise again to the bright water without wanting anything, the concubine understands that the open confrontation will begin not with a shout, not with a broken bridge, not with a fall, but with a sentence once spoken so gently it can be mistaken for hospitality. She lifts the bamboo tube's cap again and finds, tucked deep against the seam, the thing she had not felt the first time. A hair-thin sliver of iron stamped with the envoy's gate mark, bent once. A hinge without a door, an answer without a question. She smiles, small, private, the kind of curve that leaves no fingerprint on the day, and murmurs to the room, after, and the room, finally, whispers back with the creak of a board that most people call age, but which accuracy calls agreement. The hour closes like a sleeve drawn neatly over a wrist, and the procession thins. The garden returns to pretending it is only beauty, and somewhere between the moss and the plank and the unambitious sky, the first petal decides to let go, falling in such ordinary grace that everyone who sees it forgets, for a moment, that it was warning them. The evening does not arrive, it seeps, like ink from a brush that has been left too long in water, dark rising from the base of the walls until the ceiling learns its weight. The garden's brightness thins into a suggestion, lanterns making their slow decision about where to stand in the dark. The concubine remains in her chamber, map unfolded on the low table, corners still anchored by the 3 silks, as if this arrangement could hold back the shape of the hours. She has not lit the lamp, preferring the window's last, exhausted light, the kind that shows the truth of wood grain and the stubborn lives of threads. The maid enters without the hesitation of someone announcing themselves. Her silence is its own permission, and places a tray with soup no more assertive than warm rain, a bowl of pickled plum, and a small dish of mountain greens that smell faintly of stone. There will be music later, near the moon platform, she says, eyes on the floor. The principal wife has asked for your presence. No mention of why. No need requests from that quarter arrive already weighted. The concubine nods, lifts a spoon as if it were a brush, and lets the heat of the soup speak for a while. The taste is a message in a language she knows but is not fluent in. When the tray is taken away, the map remains, and the room seems to wait for her to fold it, but she does not. In the corridor, footsteps practice being only what they are. 2 guards pass, speaking of the weather as if the weather could overhear. The steward appears in the garden path, hands behind his back, posture reading the distance between the pavilion and the gate. His eyes rest on the moon platform for 1 heartbeat longer than it takes to see it. Then they move on, but the rest of him does not. By the time she steps into the outer walkway, night has learned its balance deep enough to hide the edges, light enough for the lanterns to remember their promises. The air smells of early blossom and the faint metal of coins recently handled. She walks the long way to the platform, tracing a route that lets her pass the long pond koi still awake, still gathering near the bridge as though there is something below worth guarding. The mossed step is damp but not from rain. She does not look directly at the place where the ivory token had been, though her eyes count it absent without asking permission. The moon platform tonight is half stage, half trap. Musicians sit in shadow, letting their instruments become silhouettes. Dancers are dressed not for celebration but for memory sleeves, long enough to erase the line between hand and air. Colors so faded they must have been chosen deliberately. The principal wife is already seated at the high cushion, the lord at her right, while the envoy at a respectful distance. The steward between, like a bridge, neither side has agreed to cross. The concubine kneels opposite, in the place where the lantern light is enough to make her visible, but not enough to make her understood. Music begins not with sound, but with the movement of a plectrum in the player's hand, anticipation made visible. When the note arrives, it does so like a single drop into a still basin, ripples traveling farther than their size. The second note joins as if it had been waiting. The air becomes a fabric woven from pauses. The dancers rise, their sleeves drawing shapes that belong to no written character, but might be read by someone who knows how to listen with their eyes. The Lord watches without moving his head, the wife's gaze fixed on the middle distance, the envoys on the floor, the stewards on nothing at all. And yet, in the middle of this stillness, the concubine feels the map in her chamber shift, as though something unseen has leaned over it. The first poem is offered by the calligraphy master, an image of frost melting on the edge of a blade. Polite murmurs approve. The librarian recites a verse about lanterns, bowing to the wind. The envoy speaks of mountain shadows carrying news to the sea. Then the Lord gestures toward the concubine. She bows and gives a tanka. A pond at night silence. Koi circle where bridge once spoke. Blossoms count the breaths. Lanterns listen for a name. Gate waits without opening. The steward's eyes flicker just enough to be counted. The principal wife's mouth closes a fraction too soon. The envoy's sleeve shifts, showing the wrong thread again. As the music softens into something that could be mistaken for quiet, the first interruption comes, not a messenger, but a lantern, its oil spent too early. Flames sighing out into the night. The guard steps forward to replace it, but the steward raises one hand, leave it dark. In the dark, the platform feels smaller. In the smaller space, the envoy leans closer to the Lord, under the guise of listening to the music. The Lord nods once, the kind of nod that could mean agreement or dismissal. The principal wife looks at the concubine then, not with suspicion, not with approval, but with the measure one uses for a door to see whether it will close without sound. When the music ends, and servants bring tea in bowls so thin the light seems to move through them, the concubine accepts hers and feels. Beneath the rim, a shallow indentation no other bowl carries. Inside the indentation, under her thumb, something slides paper, folded twice, no larger than a grain slip. She does not look. She drinks. The bowl is taken. The paper is gone from her hand, though she did not move it. Across the platform, the librarian is arranging scrolls with more attention than the scrolls deserve. The second interruption is less polite. From the outer path, a voice calls for a gate to be opened, and the gate does not answer. Guards shift. The steward rises, excuses himself. The Lord and wife remain as though carved. The envoy's gaze follows the steward but returns too quickly. In the pause that follows, a dancer drops her sleeve as if to bow, but instead lets something small fall near the concubine's knee. A sliver of lacquer, curved, its edge marked with the faint trace of a gate character. She covers it with her hand as if smoothing her robe. The night deepens without cooling. The moon is an absent witness. The koi under the bridge have not moved, and somewhere beyond the visible path, a hinge waits for the door that has not yet been built. The night tightens its weave until even breath feels like thread pulled through cloth, and the moon platform half-stage, half-confession becomes a bowl holding soundless intentions. The concubine remains at its rim, every sense tuned to the small errands of lantern light and footfall, while the steward's absence grows a contour and the envoy's patience folds itself into neat, invisible squares. The musicians rest their hands without resting their posture. The principal wife's shadow lies exactly where decorum says it should, but the woman within it is measuring distances with the speed of a hawk. The Lord drinks tea as if time were a temperature to be held below boiling. Beneath the planks, the koi form a slow-moving script, the strokes thickening where the water is brightest. A breeze arrives without history, rustling sleeves, test-marking the edge of the extinguished lantern. The concubine notes how the darkness at that corner behaves no longer in absence, but an arrangement, then lowers her eyes to the lacquer sliver disguised beneath her palm. Its curve fits the soft cartilage of her thumb as if it were a memory returning to a joint, and on its edge the faint gate mark breathes when the light leans. A servant appears with fresh bowls, bows too deeply for routine, and the principal wife permits the interruption. The liquid is clear, almost shy, tasting of stones and patience. When the cup leaves the concubine's hands, a damp ring remains where her thumb had warmed the clay, and inside that ring, when she looks again, sits a square of paper thinner than doubt. She does not take it. She lets the sleeve find it as fabric will. A current invented for exactly this kind of river. Across the platform, the librarian closes a scroll that has not been opened, his sleeve heavy with a parcel which, if asked, would insist it is only paper. The steward returns at last, his left foot turned not outward nor in, but precisely straight decision wearing the body like a calm. He bends to the Lord's ear, and whatever word is delivered arrives in the room without sound, translating itself directly into posture. The Lord's spine agrees with gravity by a fraction more. The principal wife's mouth loses 1 grain of softness. The envoy arranges an expression that could be grateful to any future. A dancer steps forward for the final piece, her sleeves pale as ghosts of waves, yet when the shamisen begins, she does not move. The player draws 1 long note, then another, then a third that does not end so much as become part of the night. The dancer bows without dancing, and withdraws an absence performed as art. In that softened hush, the steward lifts his cup and says, "For the room, and not for anyone in it, we will cross the bridge again," and everyone hears the sentence he did not say. Together, they rise. The procession reforms with the inevitability of a script that remembers its cue. The extinguished lantern remains dark by instruction, shaping a path with its refusal. The envoy is placed where courtesies end and consequences begin. The principal wife on the Lord's right hand, the concubine 2 bodies behind the steward close enough to read the floor's grammar, far enough to unsay herself if the knight asks. The planks answer each foot with a note that implies wood has opinions. When the Lord steps, the sound is a steadying. When the wife steps, a hush. When the envoy steps, the plank replies with a tone too quick to linger. When the steward steps, there is the smallest groan, not of weight but of memory. The concubine places her foot where a vein in the wood recommends and hears only breath. At the far stone, the moss drinks the lantern's sideways light, and there, where earlier an ivory token had pretended to be natural, lies its echo. A thin iron hinge leaf, bent once, stamped with the same gate glyph as the lacquer sliver. No one bends to take it. No one needs to. Evidence that arranges itself is a host. The procession continues, but the knight has leveled a gaze at the place, and the place does not look away. Back beneath the pavilion's eave, the steward invites a final poem. The kind meant to salt a day, so it will not spoil. The calligraphy master obliges with snow on pine. The librarian contributes a line about bridges remembering feet. The envoy's voice ties mountains to clouds. When the concubine is asked, she gives them 5 small breaths that have learned to stand. Lantern chooses night. Plank counts names it won't keep. Koi hold their hunger. A hinge waits without a door. Camellia forgets heat. There is no applause, only acceptance, which here is louder. The wives withdraw like tides that never fight the shore. Officials turn into silhouettes in corridors that remember other silhouettes. The Lord leaves last, the steward falling into orbit. The envoy lingers a heartbeat, then folds himself into the path the darkness made for him. The concubine remains seated until the platform forgets it is a platform and becomes wood again, until the koi decide their silence has done enough work. The walk back to her chamber is stitched from careful detours. Under the camphor where shadows wear perfume, past the stone basin where the bamboo dipper keeps practicing patience, along the corridor whose floorboard speaks one creak the way an old friend does, only to those who have earned it. At her threshold, the shoji is closed an extra finger width, the maid's way of saying the room has learned new information. Inside, the map waits on the low table, its corners still held by white, black, gray. In the west corner, where dusk once sat, a new weight keeps the paper true. A small ivory token, twin to the one the garden pretended to grow, placed with the carved side down as if to protect the room from knowing too much at once. Beside it, a bowl has been set with water that has not boiled a coolness advised by the stranger whose voice never wears rank. Floating in that bowl is the pressed camellia, the color of old cream, now softening at the edges, returning to its former shape without regaining its former life. She kneels. The lantern remains unlit. Moonlight writes the room in silver and mercy. She turns the token over and finds the glyph not for gate, but for stop, the same woot that had visited her in gold-flecked ink, stern but not unkind. She places it on the map, where the long pond's circle gleams and watches, as nothing happens, then agrees that nothing is the exact amount of happening required. A soft step outside, the kind that keeps the air from remembering footfall. The maid's whisper like cloth folding. The principal wife requests a private incense. A sentence that means story, not smoke. The concubine rises, smooths sleeves into a truth that cannot be contradicted by the eye, and follows the route that allows a glance at the moon platform now empty. Its dark lantern still choosing to instruct the night. The wife's chamber is a sculpted quiet, 3 censers drawing the simplest of lines between breath and ash. The wife invites her to sit, then does not speak for the length of a stick of incense, the smoke stacking patience into the air. When words arrive, they are precise enough to be kind. Bridges, she says, are made of agreements more than wood. Silence, then. Some agreements have been moved. I would like you to notice which without stepping on any of them. The concubine bows. The wife's eyes rest not on her, but on the place where the wall meets the floor. When a comb points east in a room with no window, she continues, finishing the question she began days ago, which way is the river? The answer here is not a direction. It is a vow not to answer for anyone else. The concubine gives it with the depth of her neck and the angle of her hands. The wife allows a line of weariness to be seen, and in that merciful confession the room becomes briefly human, dismissed without being dismissed. She walks a path that has learned newly to curve. At the turn by the camellia hedge, a figure waits, hat brim drawing a private horizon. No greeting, only a small bamboo tube held level on an open palm. After, the voice says, and now the word has a place to sit. She takes it and does not untie the thread. There will be rain, the voice adds, only inside, then vanishes with the grace of information that refuses ownership. Back in her chamber, the bowl has released the last stiffness from the flower. She lifts the camellia with 2 fingers and lays it, damp and obedient, on the map's unlabeled square. That is really a silence. The petals leave a circle darker than the paper, a seal made by the absence of heat. She places the ivory token over that circle and the hinge leaf beside it, then sets the lacquer sliver where a corridor line hesitates 3 small nouns that together behave like a sentence. She unties the new tube at last. Inside is no scroll but a single hair-thin pin of blackened iron and a grain of rice with a character scratched into it so finely. It must have been done by someone who has forgotten how to be clumsy. She wets the rice in the bowl, and when it glistens, the character resolves. High open. The pin belongs to a lock that does not admit it needs one. She breathes once, then twice, and puts both objects back to sleep. The palace chooses its midnight then. The watch clappers kiss the hour. The roofs cool and release their long, slow sigh. Somewhere a lute refuses melancholy and volunteers silence. The koi write a softer script. The dark lantern remains loyal to its refusal. And the steward, wherever he is, continues holding his foot precisely straight. She writes in the ledger not a poem, not a report, but an alignment. Gate without hinge. Hinge without door. Door without sound. Sound without witness. Witness without name. The ink dries into its small permanence. She seals it with the camellia stamp the steward pretended not to give her and hides the page, where even her own future will have to look twice. Sleep should arrive now by agreement, but the night negotiates an extension. A shadow touches her shoji and drifts on. A small tapping like rain explores the sill where there is no storm. And the bowl quivers, as if something beneath the wood has remembered water. She does nothing, which is everything. When at last the dark thins in the east and dawn begins rehearsing color on the undersides of clouds, she lies down, not to forget, but to memorize more efficiently. The room cools around her into the shape of a kept promise. And far away, at a gate that has not opened in years, a hinge that belongs to no door, gives one tiny, satisfied click the sound of a plan, deciding it has found the right evening to be inevitable.